Okay, so Thanksgiving Day 2015. That's a day that's kind of carved into my brain for all the wrong reasons. I've always been an avid hunter, you know. Been doing it since I was a kid with my dad. Grew up in Arkansas, and White County's always been one of my go-to spots. Public land, but way out there, near this place called Searcy, basically in the middle of nowhere. That's how I liked it. Peace and quiet, just me and the woods. That day, it was supposed to be a good one. Crisp air, leaves turning, perfect for deer hunting. I was out there before sunrise, setting myself up in my usual spot, overlooking a decent-sized valley. Spent the morning and early afternoon just being there. Didn't see much deer-wise, just squirrels and birds doing their thing. Honestly, I was fine with that. Sometimes just being out there is enough, you know? Getting away from everything. But as the afternoon started to fade and the sun dipped lower, things started feeling off. Not like a sudden thing, just a gradual creep. The woods started to get that late day quiet, you know, where all the usual daytime noises just kind of fade and it gets heavy. Even the wind seemed to die down. I remember checking my watch. Must have been around 4:30, maybe 5. Dusk was coming on fast. I was thinking about packing it in, heading back before it got completely dark. And then it happened. I heard this rustle up above me on the ridge. Didn't think much of it at first, just figured it was a squirrel or something. But then, thwack! Something clipped the top of my head and landed right in front of me. Scared the living crap out of me, to be honest. I jumped up, heart pounding. Adrenaline just floods you in a moment like that, you know? I spun around, shotgun already up, finger on the trigger. My flashlight was mounted on the rifle part, so I flipped it on, that beam cutting through the fading light. I'm sweeping it back and forth, trying to see what the hell just hit me. Nothing at first. Just trees, shadows getting longer. But then, as I panned the light to my right into the tree line, I saw it. Something big, really big. Behind this massive oak tree, like the kind that's been there for centuries. At first, it was just a shape, darker than the shadows, if that makes sense. Just this bulky mass hidden in the gloom. I froze, gun still raised, light locked on that spot. And then, 2 points of light appeared in the darkness. Up high, like way higher than any deer I've ever seen. Reddish yellow, reflecting my flashlight beam back at me. Eyes. Something was watching me, from the shadows. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't just the eyes, it was the presence. You know when you're being watched? This was like that, amplified 100 times. I could feel something ancient, powerful, staring back at me. And then the sound came. It started low, a deep growl, rumbling in its chest. But it wasn't like any animal growl I've ever heard. Deeper, more resonant, almost guttural, like it was coming from the earth itself. Then it got louder. The growl turned into something else, something that clawed its way up my spine and sent ice water through my veins. It was a scream, but not a human scream, not an animal scream, something in between, but way, way worse. High-pitched and piercing, but also raw and filled with rage, pain, something primal and terrifying. It echoed through the woods, that scream, cut through the silence like a knife. Everything went dead still again except for my heart pounding in my ears. I was frozen, staring at those eyes, at that shape in the shadows. And then, without even thinking, just pure instinct, I fired. Boom! The shotgun roared, recoil slamming into my shoulder. The beam of my flashlight jumped wildly for a split second. I wasn't aiming, not really. Just pure terror reaction. I just pointed the gun towards the sound, towards those eyes, and pulled the trigger. The blast echoed, fading away into the woods. Silence again, but different this time. Heavy silence, waiting. I blinked, trying to clear my head. My ears were ringing from the gunshot. I lowered the shotgun a little, trying to refocus my light, see what I'd hit, or what I'd tried to hit. The light settled back on the oak tree, and that's when I saw it. Just to the left of where the shape had been. A big chunk of bark blasted away, splintered wood sticking out. My shot had hit the tree, not the thing, not the creature. The shape was gone, just vanished, melted back into the darkness behind the oak. The eyes were gone too. Silence again, but a silence that felt empty and full of something else, something watching. I stood there for what felt like forever, gun still raised, heart still hammering, just listening, trying to hear anything, see anything, but there was nothing, just the woods, getting darker by the second. Finally, slowly, I lowered the shotgun completely. My legs were shaking, my hands were trembling so bad I could barely hold the gun steady. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself down, to make sense of what just happened. Had I imagined it? Had my mind played tricks on me in the fading light? But the rock, and the scream, and those eyes. No, it was real. Something had been there, something big and angry, and scared. I don't know. Curiosity, morbid curiosity maybe, started to creep in, pushing back the fear a little. I had to know what it was, what I had seen, what I had shot at. I took a step forward, then another, towards the oak tree, towards where the shape had been. My light cut through the gloom, illuminating the ground in front of me. Leaves, twigs, dirt, and something else. Blood. Dark, thick blood smeared on the bark of the oak tree, right next to the fresh shotgun blast. And hair. Strands of thick, dark hair, matted with blood, embedded in the splintered wood. It wasn't deer hair, wasn't bear hair, wasn't like anything I'd ever seen before, thick, coarse, and almost black in the dim light. My stomach turned. Whatever it was, I had hit it. Not directly, not with the shot, but close enough to draw blood and hair. Adrenaline surged through me again, but this time it was mixed with something else, grim determination. I had to know. I had to see what it was, what I had done. I started following the blood trail. It wasn't hard to see. Big drops splattered on the leaves, leading away from the oak tree, down into the valley, down into the darkness. I moved slowly, cautiously, shotgun raised again, light cutting through the undergrowth. The woods were getting really dark now, shadows stretching everywhere. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump. My senses were on high alert, every nerve ending screaming. The blood trail led me deeper into the valley, down a steep slope into a thicker part of the woods. The air got colder, damper. The smell of the woods changed. Musty, earthy, and something else. Something rank, like rotting meat. But not exactly. Hard to describe, just bad. And then I saw it. Through the trees ahead of me. A shape. Different shape this time. Taller, more pointed. Sort of like a teepee. I stopped dead in my tracks, stared at it. It was crude, built out of branches and something dark, like hides maybe, leaning against each other, forming a cone shape. It looked unnatural. Out of place, like something from a different time or a different world. I crept closer, heart pounding in my chest again. The smell got stronger, that rank, repulsive odor. It was coming from the teepee. As I got closer, I could see bones scattered around the base of it. Animal bones, deer bones, rabbit bones, squirrel bones. Gnawed, clean, bleached white by the weather, like a graveyard of small animals around this structure. My skin crawled. What the hell was this place? Who, or what, built this? I moved closer still, circling around the teepee, keeping my shotgun raised. I peered inside the opening. Dark. Couldn't see much, but the smell was overpowering now, hitting me full force. Like a mix of wet dog, rotting flesh, and something else I couldn't identify, just foul. And then I heard it again, a sound, not the scream this time, different, more animalistic, like wrestling, grunting, scuffling sounds, coming from behind the teepee, deeper in the woods. I froze, listened. The sounds continued, louder now, definitely wrestling, like something big struggling with something else, or maybe with each other. Slowly, carefully, I moved around the teepee towards the sounds. My light cut through the darkness again, searching, and then I saw it, a briar patch, thick, tangled, thorny, and the wrestling sounds were coming from inside it. I hesitated. Briar patches are nasty, hard to get through, easy to get tangled up, but the sounds, the curiosity, the fear, it pushed me forward. I had to see. I had to know. I took a deep breath and pushed my way into the edge of the briar patch. Thorns snagging my clothes, scratching my skin. I pushed through, branches snapping, leaves rustling, my light sweeping ahead of me, trying to pierce the tangled darkness. And then I saw them, through the thorns, in a small clearing in the briar patch. 3 figures, standing there, motionless, watching me. Big figures, much bigger than I expected. Taller than a man, bulkier, broader, covered in fur, thick, dark fur, like the hair I found on the oak tree, but covering their entire bodies. 2 of them were massive, towering figures, standing upright, almost human-like in posture, but not human. Too big, too wild-looking. And then there was a third one, smaller, shorter, reddish-brown fur instead of dark black, but still big. Definitely not human, juvenile maybe. They were just standing there, side by side, not moving, not making a sound, except for their breathing, heavy, raspy breaths. I could hear it even from where I was, and their eyes, glowing, reddish-yellow in the darkness, just like the one I saw behind the oak. 6 eyes, staring at me, fixed on me, unblinking. It hit me then, all at once, the size, the shape, the fur, the eyes, the teepee, the bones. This wasn't just one creature, this was a family of things, living out here in the woods, hidden, secret. And I had stumbled right into their home, their territory, and I had shot at one of them, injured one of them. My blood ran cold, my grip on the shotgun loosened. The fear, it was different now. Not just terror. It was something deeper, something more primal, awe maybe, disbelief, and a strange sense of intrusion. They just stood there watching me. No aggression, no growls, no screams. Just observation, intense, silent observation. The 2 big ones and the smaller one in the middle. A family tableau under my flashlight beam, in the heart of the Arkansas woods. I lowered my shotgun. Slowly, deliberately, pointed it down at the ground. I didn't know why. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was something else. Maybe it was the realization that I was the intruder here. I was the one who had crossed the line, into their world. I stood there, frozen, lowered gun in my hands, light shining on them, and they staring back, silent, unmoving. Time seemed to stop. Everything else faded away. Just me and them, in the briar patch, in the darkness. And then, as silently as they had appeared, they were gone. Just vanished. Melted back into the shadows of the briar patch, disappeared into the woods, like ghosts, like figments of my imagination. One moment they were there, 3 hulking figures staring at me. The next moment, nothing. Empty briar patch. Silence, except for the sound of my own ragged breathing. I stood there for a long time, not moving, not making a sound, just listening, looking, searching for any sign of them. But there was nothing, just the woods, dark, silent, and empty. Eventually, slowly, I backed out of the briar patch. My legs were like jelly, my whole body was trembling. I turned and walked away, back towards my stand, back towards civilization. I didn't run, just walked. As fast as I could without running, kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see them again, expecting to hear that scream again. But there was nothing, just the woods and the silence. I walked all the way back to my truck in the dark, without stopping. Didn't even look back. Just got in, started the engine, and drove. Drove as fast as I could, back to town, back to lights, back to people. I haven't been back to those woods since. Haven't been hunting in White County again. Haven't told many people about what happened. Most folks would think I'm crazy or lying, And honestly, sometimes I almost think I imagined it myself. But I know I didn't. I know what I saw, what I heard, what I smelled. I know the blood and hair I found on that oak tree were real. And those eyes, those glowing red-yellow eyes, I'll never forget them. I still don't know what they were. Sasquatch? Something else? Some kind of creature that science hasn't discovered yet? I have no idea, and I probably never will. But I know one thing for sure. Out there, deep in the woods, in places we think we know, there are things we don't understand. Things that are different. Things that are hidden. And sometimes they watch us back. And sometimes you become the hunted instead of the hunter. And that's something I'll never forget. That Thanksgiving Day in 2015, the day I became the prey, the day I met them. And I still can't explain it. I just saw them, and then they were gone, just like that. And that's the end of it. I don't know what else to say. Story 2. Look, I don't usually talk about this. It's been eating at me for years, just this thing in the back of my mind. People talk about crazy stuff online all the time, but this wasn't online. This was real life. And it messed me up bad. It was 89. Fall. The air was crisp, you know? That mountain air that just bites a little when you breathe it in, makes you feel alive. We were up in the wilderness, high country, where the trees get thin and the rocks start sticking out everywhere. Routine hike, honestly. Something I'd done 100 times. Me, my son Ralph, his friend David. Ralph was just a kid then. David a year or two older, always trying to keep up with me. Good boys, loved the outdoors, same as me. My parents came along too that day, and my niece Tina, she was maybe 13, quiet kid. Family day out, that's all it was supposed to be. We were exploring an area near these old mining tunnels. Been there forever, boarded up, mostly caved in now, just scars on the mountainside. I remember thinking about the guys who must have worked those mines back in the day, what it must have been like, that kind of hard, lonely life. Dad and Tina were lagging behind a bit, just taking it slow. I told them to wait up while I went to check something off the trail. Just a little scramble up a rocky bit, thought I saw something interesting. I wasn't gone long, maybe 5-10 minutes tops. When I came back, they weren't there. Just gone. I called out, "Dad? Tina?" Silence. My heart did a little jump then, that little flutter of unease you get when something's just not right. Then, out of nowhere, they're just back, walking towards me like nothing happened. "Where'd you go?" I asked, kind of sharper than I meant to. Dad looked a bit dazed, I guess, like he'd just woken up. "We didn't go anywhere, Theodore," he said, voice a little shaky. "Just here." Tina nodded, eyes wide and a bit scared looking. "Yeah, we didn't move, Uncle Theodore." I frowned. "But I just went up there and you weren't here. Where were you then?" Dad shrugged, rubbed his forehead. "I don't know. Just here. I heard something, though." "Heard what?" I asked. "Voices," he said, voice low. "Garbled voices. Like someone talking underwater. Couldn't make out what they were saying, just strange." Scared Tina a bit. Tina just hugged herself tighter. I glanced around. Nothing. Just the wind in the pines, the rustle of leaves underfoot, the distant sound of a stream. Normal mountain sounds, but Dad was shaken, I could see it, and Tina was spooked. "Probably just the wind playing tricks, Dad," I said, trying to sound casual, but honestly, a chill was creeping up my spine. Voices underwater. That's just weird. "Let's keep going." We're heading towards that clearing where I was thinking about putting up that marker. I wanted to place a small stone marker for Mom. She'd passed away a few years before, loved these mountains. We kept walking. The feeling of unease didn't leave me, though. Dad's voice was still bothering me, that weird underwater voices thing, but I tried to shake it off. Out in the woods, your mind can play tricks on you. Sound travels funny, echoes off rocks, bends around trees. Probably just that, I told myself. We walked further and the trail started to change. It was like something big had just gone through there, not like animal tracks, nothing like that. It was devastated, like a small earthquake had hit just that section of trail. Big rocks displaced, pushed off the path, some turned over like they'd been tossed aside like pebbles. Smaller trees were snapped clean in half. Bigger ones were leaning at weird angles, their roots ripped out of the ground, and there was this stuff all over the rocks, the broken trees, the ground, green slime. Not bright green, more like a dark, mossy green, almost black in places. It was thick, kind of gooey looking, and it smelled wrong. Not rotten, not decaying, just chemically, almost. Like something artificial, but definitely organic at the same time. We stopped, everyone stopped, just staring at this mess. Ralph and David were pointing at the broken trees, whispering to each other. Even Dad, who'd seemed out of it before, was staring, eyes wide open now, face pale. Tina was clinging to his arm, real fear in her eyes now. "What the hell?" I said, voice barely a whisper. I'd never seen anything like it. Never in all my years in the mountains. Storm damage, maybe? But this wasn't storm damage. This was violent, and that green slime, it was just so out of place. "Voices," Dad said again, voice even quieter this time, like he was afraid to speak too loud. Maybe those voices did this." I shook my head, but a cold knot was tightening in my stomach. Voices causing this? That's insane. But what else could it be? There were no landslides, no signs of blasting, no logging. Just this destruction and this weird green stuff. We kept going, pushing through the mess, carefully stepping over the broken trees and around the slime-covered rocks. It got worse as we went. More destruction, more slime. It was like we were walking through some kind of wound in the mountainside. Finally, we reached the clearing. It was supposed to be this peaceful, open space, a place where you could see for miles. But it was the same as the trail. More broken trees, more displaced rocks, more of that unnatural green slime everywhere. The spot where I'd planned to put Mom's marker. It was just a pile of rubble and broken branches now. I stood there, just staring at it all, trying to make sense of it. It wasn't making any sense. It was like something angry had come through here and just ripped everything apart. And those voices Dad heard, were they connected? Left everything else. Left the house, left Silent Creek. I didn't even look back. I'm in a motel now, a couple of towns over. Don't know what I'm going to do. Don't know where to go. Just gone. Abandoned my life, my home, everything. Because of that. I can still see it. Standing at the window, those eyes, those long, disjointed arms, that smell. I can still smell it sometimes, even here. A phantom stench in my nostrils, and I hear those thumps in my dreams, in the quiet moments. Thump, thump, thump. I don't know what it was. I don't know what it wanted. I don't know if it's still there, in my garden, in the woods, watching, waiting. I just know I couldn't stay. I couldn't live with that fear anymore. I had to get out, had to run, and I still don't understand it. I replay it in my head, over and over, trying to make sense of it. But there's no sense to be made. It was wrong. Something fundamentally, terrifyingly wrong. And I can't shake the feeling that it's not over, that somehow, somewhere, that thing is still out there, and that it might find me again. Was something out here? I started to clear a space just automatically, pulling away branches, moving smaller rocks, trying to salvage the spot for Mum's marker. Just something to do, to focus on, to get my mind off the weirdness, the fear that was creeping deeper into me. That's when I heard it. It was like an echo, but not a normal echo. It was deeper, more resonant, like the mountain itself was speaking. And it wasn't just a sound, it was a vibration. I felt it in my chest, in my bones. It came from the hillside above the clearing, from the trees, from the rocks, from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Whom? That's the closest I can get to describing it in words. Just whom. Echoing, reverberating, my head snapped up. My heart was pounding now, not just the unease anymore, but real, cold fear. Someone was up there, and they were making that sound, but it didn't sound like any person I'd ever heard. It sounded animal, but not animal either, bigger than animal, something other. I thought, maybe it's someone else hiking, someone got lost, needs help. But that sound, it didn't sound like anyone needing help. It sounded hostile, like a warning. I told everyone to stay put, stay quiet. I had a small pistol on me, just for mountain lions, never thought I'd ever need it. But suddenly I wanted it in my hand. I told Dad to keep everyone together, get them back towards the trail, slowly, quietly. I said I was going to go up there, see what was going on, make sure it was safe. Lying through my teeth. I was terrified, but I had to know, had to see. I scrambled up this rocky outcrop to get a better view of the hillside. It was steep, loose rock, hard to get a grip, but I pushed myself up, pulling myself hand over hand, got to the top and looked out. And then the hillside just exploded. Not literally, not like bombs, but that's the only word for it. Exploded. Trees just shattered, snapped in half, ripped out of the ground, rocks flying, dirt and debris everywhere, and this massive black shape crashing through the trees, coming right for me. My first thought, instant reaction, was bear. Grizzly. Huge black shape, tearing through the trees, must be a bear. But then it got closer, and I saw, and I knew. It wasn't a bear. It was wrong. It was bipedal, walking upright, but bigger than any man, bigger than any bear I'd ever seen or heard of. Immense, massive, and it was coming straight at me, crashing through the trees, destroying everything in its path. Terror, pure, raw terror. I've never felt anything like it. My body just locked up, paralyzed. My mind was screaming, but my body wouldn't move. My hand fumbled for the pistol in my jacket pocket, small .38, useless against that. I couldn't even get my fingers around the grip, just numb, frozen. It kept coming, closer, closer, and I could see it clearer now. Not a bear, not even close. It was a creature, upright, covered in jet black hair, thick, matted-looking hair, and its face wrinkled, ruddy brown, like old leather, but the size of it, like something out of a nightmare, a monster. Then, out of the brush, to the side of the first one, another one came, smaller, but still huge. And this one, it had a rock in its hand, a rock the size of a basketball. And it wasn't just holding it. It raised it up, high above its head, and then, with a roar that shook the ground, it hurled the rock down, not at me, but at the ground, just in front of me, maybe 30 feet away. Crash. The rock exploded into fragments, showering dirt and pebbles everywhere, and the creature roared again, louder this time, and then it did it again, raised another rock, same size, same roar, hurled it down. Crash. Closer this time, then a third. Crash. Even closer. Warning shots. That's what they were. Warning shots. They were hunting me. Not one, two. And I was the prey. The first one, the big one, kept coming. The rock thrower, the second one, started moving too, tearing through the trees to get around to my side, cutting off my escape. I snapped then. The paralysis broke. Survival instinct kicked in. I turned and ran, scrambled back down the rocks, stumbling, falling, tearing my hands and knees, but I didn't care. Just had to get away, had to get back to the road, to safety, to something that wasn't this nightmare. I ran like I'd never run before, didn't look back, couldn't look back, just the sound of them behind me, crashing through the forest, trees snapping, rocks rolling, an avalanche of debris raining down behind me as they chased me. The ground vibrated with their footsteps, the roars echoed through the mountains. I could smell them now, this rank, musky smell, like wet dog and something else, something feral, something primal. I kept running, blindly, desperately, just heading downhill towards the road, praying, screaming in my head, just wanting to live, to escape this horror. I could hear Ralph and David and my parents shouting behind me, somewhere back in the clearing, calling my name, confused, terrified. I couldn't stop, couldn't go back for them, just had to run, save myself. I ran for what felt like forever, lungs burning, legs screaming, vision blurring. Finally, through the trees, I saw it. The road, the dirt road, the logging road, but still a road. Civilization, safety, maybe. I burst out of the trees and onto the road, tripped, fell, skidded on the gravel, scraped my hands and face. But I was on the road, and I looked back, and they stopped, just at the edge of the trees, both of them. Standing there, massive, black, watching me. The big one and the rock thrower. They didn't come onto the road, just stood there silhouetted against the trees, like guardians of that nightmare forest. And they watched me, and I watched them. For a long, frozen moment. Then, slowly, they turned and walked back into the trees, disappeared into the shadows, like ghosts fading back into the darkness. I lay there on the side of the road, gasping for breath, heart hammering, shaking like a leaf. Broken. Just broken. Physically, mentally, everything. I lay there for a long time, staring at the trees, expecting them to come back, expecting to die. Eventually, I heard them. My family. Ralph, David, Dad, Tina. They came stumbling out of the trees, faces white, eyes wide with terror. They'd seen it too. They'd seen them, not as close as me, but they'd seen them, heard them, felt the ground shake. We just stood there on the side of the road, huddled together, trembling. Couldn't speak, couldn't move. Just survivors. Barely. We walked back down the road. Miles. Silent miles. Got to the truck, drove home in silence. No one said a word about it. Not that night. Not ever, really. We tried to pretend it didn't happen, tried to bury it, but I couldn't. I see them every time I close my eyes. Those black shapes, those faces, that terrifying power, that unearthly roar. They're still there, in the mountains, watching, waiting. And I know deep down, I know we were lucky that day. Lucky to get away. Lucky to be alive. But sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I still hear that echo. Womb. And I wonder what else is out there in the darkness, in the wild places that we don't understand. Things beyond our control, beyond our comprehension. Things that are ancient and powerful and utterly terrifying. And I know with a cold certainty that whatever I saw that day, it was just a glimpse, just a fleeting look into a world we're not meant to see. A world that's still out there, waiting. Story 3. This particular morning, pitch black, gotta be maybe 4 in the morning, still star time. I was heading out to a lumber mill a bit outside of Cold Creek, route I always take, Blackwood Trail. It's this winding road, pretty isolated, goes through thick woods. Normally, it's just deer you gotta watch out for, sometimes raccoons, the usual critters. Never seen anything too out of the ordinary in all my years driving that road. But this morning, this was different. I was coming around this bend, one of those sharp ones where you gotta slow down even in the daytime. And my headlights, they caught something moving across the road. It was fast, man, really fast. Like blink, and you miss it fast, but I definitely saw it. For a split second, everything just stopped. My breath caught in my chest. My foot just automatically went for the brake, not slamming it on, but enough to kill some speed because, honestly, I didn't know what the hell I was seeing. It was dark, completely dark, like a shadow cut out of the night, and tall, way taller than a person, taller than a deer, taller than anything that should be moving around in those woods. It moved from the east side of the road to the west, just crossing right in front of my truck. And the speed, that's what got me. It wasn't running, it was like gliding, flowing across the road. No wasted movement, no stumbling, just this impossibly smooth, fast motion. I only saw it for maybe 2 seconds, maybe less, before it disappeared into the trees on the other side of the road. My heart was pounding. I gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles probably went white. For a moment there, I just sat, engine idling, staring at the spot where it had vanished, thinking, did I just see that? Did my eyes play tricks on me? It wasn't deer, it wasn't a bear. I know animals, grew up in the woods. This wasn't anything I recognized. It was too wrong, too fast, too tall, too shadowy. I kept telling myself it was just the darkness, playing with my eyes, making things look weird. Maybe a weirdly shaped tree branch fell across the road, and my headlights caught it at a weird angle. Yeah, that had to be it. That's what my brain was trying to convince me of. Anything to make sense of it, because the other option, the option that was whispering in the back of my mind, that was way scarier. I shook my head, trying to clear it. Get it together, Jedediah, I mumbled to myself. Just drive. It's early. You're tired. So I put the truck back in gear, eased off the brake and kept going. But my hands were still shaking. My eyes kept flicking back to the rearview mirror, then to the side mirrors, then back to the road ahead, like I was expecting to see it again, popping out of the trees. Every shadow looked darker. Every rustle in the leaves sounded louder. The whole drive to the mill, I was on edge. My mind just kept replaying those few seconds, that dark shape moving impossibly fast across the road. I got to the mill, did my job, unloaded the truck, went through the motions. But I wasn't really there, you know. My head was still back on Blackwood Trail, back in that darkness, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I tried to talk myself out of it all day. It was nothing, Jedediah. You're just stressed. Long hours, early mornings, messing with your head. But deep down, I knew I had seen something real, and it wasn't right. The weirdest thing, nobody else seemed to notice anything. I mentioned it to a couple of guys at the mill, tried to play it off like it was nothing, just, hey, anyone ever see anything strange out on Blackwood Trail? They just looked at me like I was nuts. Said it's just woods, maybe coyotes or something. Nothing to worry about. That just made me feel even weirder. Like I was the only one who had experienced this, the only one who knew something was off. It was isolating. By the time I finished my shift and was heading back home, it was late afternoon, still daylight, but the sun was starting to dip down behind the trees. I knew I was going to drive back down Blackwood Trail. And honestly, I was dreading it. I didn't want to go back there, back to that bend in the road, but at the same time, I had to. Curiosity, maybe. Stupidity, probably. But something was pulling me back. I needed to see it again, in daylight this time, maybe prove to myself it was just something normal, something explainable. I needed to get rid of this creeping feeling that something really strange had happened. So, I drove back. Sunlight was fading, shadows were getting long, but it was still light enough to see clearly. As I got closer to that bend, my stomach started to tighten up. I slowed down way before I even got there, peering into the woods on both sides of the road, scanning, searching. Like I was hunting for something, or maybe being hunted. I reached the bend, the same bend. I stopped the truck right where I thought it had crossed, killed the engine, put it in park, and just sat there for a minute, listening. Everything was quiet. Too quiet, maybe. Just the rustling of leaves in the breeze, birds chirping in the distance. Normal forest sounds, but under it all, there was this stillness, this feeling of being watched. I took a deep breath and got out of the truck. My legs felt a little shaky. I walked to the side of the road where I thought it had come from, the east side. Just woods, trees, undergrowth, ferns, the usual forest floor stuff. Nothing out of place, nothing weird. Okay, maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe I just freaked myself out for nothing. Then I walked over to the other side of the road, the west side, where it had disappeared into the trees. And that's when I saw it. Right there, just off the edge of the road, going down into a little ditch, the kind that runs alongside the road for drainage. There were skid marks, not from my truck, smaller, like something had slipped or slid down the bank. Weird, but maybe just some animal? I stepped closer to the ditch, peering down the slope, and then I saw more. In the muddy bottom of the ditch, where the water had pooled up, the mud was all churned and disturbed, like something heavy had moved through it, stirred it all up. Not just footprints, something bigger, something dragging. And then, following the churned mud, going up the other side of the ditch, into the tall grass at the edge of the woods. That's when I saw the drag marks. Long trails in the grass, flattened and broken, heading into the trees. Like something heavy, very heavy, had been dragged through there. And not just dragged. Pulled. Like it had been moved fast, with force. My heart started pounding again, even harder this time. This wasn't my imagination. This was real. Something had definitely been here. Something had gone off the road, into the ditch, and then been pulled into the woods. And whatever it was heavy enough to leave those drag marks, heavy enough to churn up the mud. I followed the drag marks, stepping into the tall grass. They went deeper into the woods, disappearing under the thicker trees. The light was fading fast now. The shadows were getting long and deep. The air felt colder. The silence felt heavier. I knew I shouldn't be going further. Common sense was screaming at me to turn around, get back in the truck, and get the hell out of there. But that morbid curiosity, it was still there, pulling me forward. I had to know what it was. What could have made those marks? What had I seen crossing the road? I kept going, deeper and deeper into the woods, following the trail of flattened grass and broken twigs. The drag marks were still there, clear as day, leading me further into the darkness. The trees closed in around me, blocking out the last rays of sunlight. It was getting really dark now, and the forest sounds seemed to have gone silent. Just the sound of my own breathing and the crunch of my boots on the leaves. Then I heard it. A sound. Faint, but definitely there. Coming from deeper in the woods, ahead of me. A sort of scraping sound, like something dragging across the ground. My blood ran cold. I froze, listening, holding my breath. The scraping sound came again, closer this time, and then, mixed with the scraping, another sound. A low growl, but not like any growl I'd ever heard. Deeper, guttural, almost inhuman. It vibrated through the ground, through my bones. Fear, real gut-wrenching fear gripped me. This wasn't curiosity anymore. This was danger. This was bad. I knew in that instant that I had gone too far, that whatever had made those marks, whatever I had seen on the road, it was still here. And it wasn't alone. I didn't wait to see what was making those sounds. I didn't wait to see anything at all. I turned around and ran. I ran as fast as I could, crashing through the undergrowth, not caring about branches whipping my face, not caring about tripping or falling, just ran, fueled by pure terror, back the way I had come. I could hear the scraping sound behind me getting closer, faster than it should have been, like whatever was making it was pursuing me. And that growling sound, it was louder now, closer, filled with something else, something angry. I burst out of the woods, back onto the road, scrambling up the bank, tripping on loose rocks. I didn't stop until I was back at my truck, fumbling with the door handle, throwing myself inside, slamming the door shut, locking it. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. I started the engine, threw it in reverse and peeled out of there. Didn't even bother with my lights for the first few seconds, just wanted to get away, get as much distance as possible between me and those woods. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back on the main highway, lights of towns in the distance, other cars on the road. Only then did I finally slow down, pull over to the side of the road, and just breathe. Trying to calm my racing heart, trying to stop shaking. I sat there for a long time, just staring out the windshield, trying to process what had happened, trying to make sense of it. But I couldn't. I still can't. I never went back to Blackwood Trail. Not in the dark, not in the day. I take a different route now, even if it's longer. I can't bring myself to go back there. I told this story to a few people over the years, always leaving out the really scary parts, just saying I saw something weird out in the woods. Most people just laugh it off, say it was my imagination, stress, whatever. They don't believe me. And honestly, sometimes I almost start to doubt it myself. Almost. But then, I remember the feeling. That cold, creeping dread, that primal fear that went right down to my bones. And I remember the drag marks in the mud, the scraping sound in the dark woods, that inhuman growl. And I know I saw something out there that morning. Something that shouldn't be there. Something dark, fast, and terrifying, and I have no idea what it was. And that's the part that still keeps me up at night. The not knowing. The absolute terrifying unknown of what's out there in the dark woods of Redwood County. Sometimes late at night when it's really quiet, I still think I can hear that scraping sound, far off in the distance. And I shiver, even now, just remembering it. That feeling, it doesn't go away. Story 4. I live out in Serenity Peaks, up near Crystal Lake. It's beautiful, real secluded, which is exactly why I moved here. Peace and quiet was the whole point. My house is set back in the woods, off a long winding driveway, and honestly, for the first few years it was perfect. Just me, the trees, and the occasional deer wandering through my yard. Then things started to feel off. It was gradual. First, it was the dogs. My neighbors have a couple of those big, slobbery hounds that usually just laze around all day, barely even barking at the mailman. Suddenly, they were going nuts. Not just barking, but this frantic, terrified howling that would start up in the middle of the night and echo through the valley. It was like they were seeing something that wasn't there, something that was really scaring them. And it wasn't just for a few minutes either. Sometimes it would go on for hours. At first, I thought maybe a bear was getting closer to the houses than usual, but bears don't usually make dogs react like that. This was different, a deep, primal fear coming from them. Then it was the deer. We have tons of deer around here, always have. They're practically pests in the summer, eating everything in sight, but suddenly they were gone, vanished. It's not like deer just disappear completely, especially not in October when they're usually all over the place getting ready for winter. It was like they were avoiding the woods around my house. I'd see a few on the road further down the mountain, but never near my place. It felt empty, unnaturally quiet in the woods. And the sounds, that's when it really started to get to me. At night, after everything else went quiet, I started hearing things. At first, I dismissed them as just the woods being the woods. You know, branches breaking, wind in the trees, the usual nighttime noises. But some of these sounds were different. There was this rustling, a heavy rustling, deeper in the woods than any deer or raccoon could make, like something big moving through the underbrush. And then, sometimes mixed in with the rustling, was this sighing sound, like a long, drawn-out exhale, but wet. I don't know how else to describe it. Wet and raspy, like something struggling to breathe, or hissing, but not quite. It was low and unsettling, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. One morning, I was walking my property line, just checking things out, when I stumbled across something that really freaked me out. It was a pile of bones, deer bones, but not scattered like they would be if a coyote got to them, or even a bear. These were piled together neatly, almost deliberately in a small clearing I hadn't even known was there. The skulls were all facing in the same direction, toward the deeper woods. It was wrong, just wrong, like some kind of ritualistic thing, but by what? Coyotes don't stack bones, bears just tear things apart. This was different. I started feeling genuinely uneasy. This wasn't just the normal weirdness of living in the woods. This was something else. So I did something I never thought I'd do. I called Dr. Leopold. I know it sounds ridiculous. A paranormal investigator. But a friend of mine had mentioned him once. Said he was surprisingly down to earth, despite his profession. And honestly, I was at a loss. I didn't know who else to talk to. The local cops would just laugh me out of the station if I told them about strange noises and piles of deer bones. Dr. Leopold actually answered the phone himself when I called. I told him about the dogs, the deer, the sounds, the bones. He listened, didn't interrupt, didn't make me feel like an idiot. He asked a few questions, mostly about the sounds and the bone pile. Then he said something that surprised me. He said, "Mr. Thorne, it might be nothing, but it might be something. I'm heading up that way next week for another case. If you're amenable, I could swing by and take a look. No charge. Just curiosity on my part." I said yes, obviously. I was desperate for some kind of explanation, even a crazy one at that point. He said he'd be there on Tuesday afternoon. Tuesday rolled around, a grey, gloomy October day. Perfectly creepy weather for the situation, honestly. Dr. Leopold arrived around 2 in the afternoon, just as the shadows were starting to get long. He was not what I expected. I pictured some weirdo with ghost hunting gear. He was just a normal-looking guy, maybe in his late 40s, dressed in jeans and a flannel shirt, carrying a camera bag. He looked more like a bird watcher than a paranormal investigator. We shook hands, and I invited him in for coffee, but he said he wanted to get right to it while there was still good light. He wanted to see the bone pile first, and then walk around the property, take some photos, that sort of thing. So we went out back. I showed him the clearing where I'd found the bones. He walked around it slowly, looking at the ground, taking pictures with a serious-looking camera. He didn't say much, just nodded occasionally, his face grim. He knelt down and examined the bones closely, turning them over, checking the way they were stacked. "Interesting," he said finally, quietly. "Very organized. Not natural scavenging, that's for sure." He took more pictures from different angles, then stood up. "Let's walk the property line a bit," he said. "Just want to get a feel for the place." We started walking along the edge of my property, deeper into the woods. It was quiet, eerily quiet, even for the woods. No birds singing, no squirrels chattering, just silence. The air was cold and damp, and the sky was getting darker by the minute. Dr. Leopold was snapping pictures of everything, trees, bushes, the ground, anything that caught his eye. He was moving slowly, deliberately, like he was searching for something specific. We walked for maybe half an hour, further and further into the woods behind my house. I was starting to get a little nervous. The silence was getting to me, and the woods felt heavy, like we were being watched. I kept glancing around, expecting to see, I don't know what exactly, but something. "Let's head back towards the house," Dr. Leopold said suddenly. "I want to get some shots of your driveway from up closer to the road." He pointed back the way we came. "It's a good vantage point to see the whole property." We turned around and started walking back up the slight incline toward my house and the road. My driveway is pretty steep and long. You can see the house from the road, but it's a bit of a climb. As we walked, I kept thinking about those bones and the sounds in the night and the way the dogs were acting. A real knot was starting to form in my stomach. We reached the top of the driveway, near where it meets the road. Dr. Leopold was still snapping pictures, this time aiming his camera down the driveway towards my house. He was focused, looking through the lens, adjusting the settings. I was just standing there, feeling uneasy, scanning the trees, and then I saw it. It wasn't a sound, it wasn't a shadow. It was there, right there, at the top of my driveway, further up, closer to the house, maybe halfway down the incline, on the right side of the driveway. Something was moving. At first I thought it was a person, but it was moving wrong, too fast, too fluid. It was moving from right to left across the driveway, across my field of vision, and it was upright, walking, no, running, but not like a person runs, more like bounding. It was tall, Taller than a person, definitely. Maybe 7, 8 feet tall, hard to say for sure. It was moving so quickly, and it was covered in fur. Dark, matted fur, brown, almost black in the fading light. It was hunched over slightly, but still clearly upright on 2 legs. My eyes snapped to its face. As it crossed the driveway, it turned its head slightly, just for a split second, and looked directly towards us. Towards me. And I saw its face. It was pale, shockingly pale, white almost in contrast to the dark fur around it, and hairy. There was hair around its face, long, straggly hair, and its face, it was like a monkey, but not quite, like a monkey's face mixed with something human. The eyes, dark, deep-set and intense, intensely intelligent, in a way that chilled me to the bone. There was a cold awareness in those eyes, and something else, something predatory. The whole sighting couldn't have lasted more than 2 or 3 seconds. It moved so fast. One moment it was there, a dark, pale-faced figure loping across my driveway, and the next, it was gone. Vanished into the trees on the other side of the driveway. I stood there, frozen. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I could just stare at the spot where it had disappeared, my heart hammering in my chest like a drum. Dr. Leopold lowered his camera. He was looking in the same direction down the driveway. He didn't say anything for a long, long moment. The only sound was the wind rustling the leaves in the trees. Finally, he turned to me. His face was pale, paler than I'd seen it before. His eyes were wide, but not with fear, more like shock and something else. Recognition. Did you see that? I managed to stammer out, my voice barely a whisper. He just nodded slowly. Once, twice. His eyes were still fixed on the spot where the thing had vanished. What was that? I asked, my voice shaking now. What the hell was that? He turned to me again, his expression unreadable. I don't know for sure, he said slowly. But I think we just saw something very, very interesting. His voice was low, almost hushed. Something that shouldn't be here. We stood there for a few more minutes in silence, just staring at the woods. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. The shadows were getting longer now, the woods darker. The air felt colder, heavier. Then Dr. Leopold finally broke the silence. "We should go inside," he said quietly. "It's getting late." He didn't take his eyes off the woods as he said it. We walked back to the house in silence, both of us looking over our shoulders every few seconds. Inside, we sat in my living room, the curtains drawn, the lights on, even though it wasn't fully dark yet outside. Dr. Leopold sat down heavily on the couch, still holding his camera. He looked different, disturbed. He finally spoke after a long, uncomfortable silence. "What you described, the dogs, the deer, the sounds, the bones," he said, his voice still low. "It fits a pattern, a very unusual pattern." He paused. "There are stories," he continued, "legends going back centuries in these mountains, stories of things that live in the deep woods, things that aren't supposed to be real." He didn't elaborate. He didn't have to. I knew what he meant. We both knew. We had seen something impossible, something that shouldn't exist, something monstrous. Dr. Leopold stayed for another hour or so. He looked through the photos he'd taken, muttering to himself. He didn't offer any explanations. He just kept saying he needed to think about things, to research. He promised he'd be in touch. Then he left. He drove off down my long driveway and disappeared back down the mountain road, leaving me alone with the image burned into my brain, the pale face, the dark eyes, the speed, the unnatural movement, alone with the bone pile in the woods and the terrified howling of the neighbors' dogs and the wet, sighing sound in the night. Dr. Leopold never called back. I tried to reach him a few times, left messages, but he never responded. It's like he vanished too. Or maybe he just didn't want to talk about it anymore. Maybe he was scared. Maybe he knew more than he was letting on and decided to just walk away. I don't know what I saw that day. I don't know what's out there in the woods behind my house. I don't know what piled those bones up or what makes those sounds in the dark. And honestly, I don't think I want to know. Part of me is terrified of finding out. I still live here. I haven't moved. Where would I go? And besides, maybe it's gone now. Maybe it was just passing through. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by too much time alone in the woods. But I know what I saw. I know it was real. And sometimes late at night when the house is quiet and the wind is blowing through the trees, I hear it again. That rustling in the underbrush and that sighing sound. Closer now sometimes, closer to the house. And I just sit here in the dark, listening and waiting, and hoping whatever it was stays away. Hoping it doesn't come back. Hoping I never see that pale face again. Because whatever it was evil. Pure, unadulterated evil, staring right back at me from the edge of the woods. And I know deep down that it's still out there, watching, waiting, and that one day it might come closer than just the driveway. Story 5. Okay, so this happened last fall. I still get the chills just thinking about it, and I wanted to finally write it down, maybe just to get it out of my head, you know. It was getting towards the end of October. That crisp, almost wintry air was starting to roll in, and the leaves were just about done turning. You know, that brown, crunchy stage. Anyway, me and Ben, my boyfriend, we were near Mirror Lake. We live close by and we go hiking there a lot. It's usually really peaceful. This time, we went a little later in the day than usual because we were both swamped with work. We finally got out there around dusk. The sun was already dipping, painting the sky all these crazy orange and purple colors, which was beautiful, but it also meant it was getting dark fast. We decided to take this trail we hadn't been on in a while, the one that skirts around the edge of the Whispering Woods. Creepy name, right? But it's just a name. Usually, it's super quiet and pretty. This evening, though, there was this kind of heaviness in the air, you know, not in a bad way exactly, but like the quiet was thicker, if that makes any sense. We were talking just about normal stuff, work, dinner, nothing important. But I remember feeling really relaxed. We were walking side by side, and Ben was snapping pictures with his phone. He's really into landscape photography. That's when I saw it. We were on this part of the trail that opens up a little bit, kind of overlooks a deeper section of the woods. It wasn't fully dark yet, more like that deep twilight where everything starts to lose its sharp edges. I just happened to glance to my right, down into this slightly lower path that runs parallel to the main one, maybe 30, 40 feet away, and there it was. At first, I wasn't even sure what I was seeing. It was a shape, moving down that lower path, further away, maybe 100 yards or so. It was dark, completely black, but it was the way it moved that made me freeze. It was hulking, big, like seriously big. And it was low to the ground, kind of hunched over. The silhouette was just weird. My brain was scrambling, trying to make sense of it. Then it hit me. It looked like a gorilla, a huge black gorilla. But not just a gorilla, because as it moved I could see these patches like skin, like bare skin on its chest. It was the weirdest thing, completely black, bulky shape, moving kind of awkwardly with these pale, hairless patches on its chest. It wasn't the smooth, defined movement of a person, or even a deer or something. It was heavier, more lumbering. My heart started hammering in my chest. I stopped dead, grabbed Ben's arm, and squeezed it hard. He actually jumped a little. "What? What is it?" he asked, sounding a bit annoyed, like I'd broken his picture-taking flow. I couldn't even speak at first. I just pointed, down into the woods, in the direction I'd seen it. There, "Did you see that?" I whispered, my voice shaking a little without me meaning to. Ben frowned, squinted, and looked where I was pointing. He looked for a good few seconds, then just shrugged. "See what? It's just trees, babe. Getting dark. Probably just shadows." He was dismissive, like he always is when I get spooked by something. "No, Ben, seriously, I saw something down there, like a gorilla." I knew it sounded insane even as I said it. Gorillas in the Whispering Woods? Ridiculous. But that's the only thing my mind could come up with. He laughed a little, a short, disbelieving chuckle. "A gorilla? Clara, seriously? There are no gorillas here. You're tired, you're seeing things. Let's just keep going, okay?" He started walking again, pulling me slightly by the arm, but I didn't move. I was still staring into the trees, trying to see if it was still there. "No, wait! I really saw something. It was big, black, moving." My voice trailed off. I was starting to doubt myself, even though I knew what I had seen. Maybe it was just shadows playing tricks on my eyes. But it felt so real. Then Ben, probably to humor me or shut me up, I don't know, he said, Okay, well, let's see your gorilla on my phone then, huh?" He meant the pictures he'd taken just before I saw whatever it was. He'd been snapping away, taking pictures of the sunset over the trees, that whole vista. He pulled out his phone and started scrolling back through his photos. I stood there, still uneasy, watching him flick through the images. Sunsets, trees, more sunsets, more trees. Then he stopped. His face changed. He went quiet. He zoomed in on one of the photos. "Whoa," he said, his voice suddenly low, not laughing anymore. He turned the phone to me. "Look at this." It was one of the pictures he'd taken just minutes before. It was a shot looking out into the trees, that same section of woods where I'd seen the thing. It was a beautiful picture, really. The golden light of the setting sun filtering through the branches. But then, in the background, way back in the shadows, almost lost in the darkness of the trees, there was something. It was blurry, indistinct, a dark shape. But it was there. It was in the direction I'd pointed. It was a dark, hulking mass. And if you squinted, if you really, really looked, it did look kind of gorilla-shaped. Dark, massive, low to the ground. My blood ran cold. It wasn't clear, not like what I had seen directly, but it was undeniably there in the picture, in the exact spot where I had seen whatever it was. Ben kept zooming in and out, tilting the phone. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he whispered, "Holy crap." That's all he said. Holy crap. And Ben is not easily spooked. We stood there for a minute, just staring at the photo on his phone, the darkness closing in around us in the woods. The beautiful sunset suddenly felt ominous, like it was the last light before something else. The air felt colder too, a real chill that went right through me, not just the evening getting cooler kind of chill. "Okay," Ben finally said, his voice still quiet, but serious now. "Okay, that's weird." He looked up from his phone, looked into the woods. It was almost completely dark now. Let's just go. Okay? Let's go home." And we did. We walked, fast, back the way we came. We didn't talk much. We just walked, and I kept looking over my shoulder even though I knew it was stupid. What was I expecting to see? It was dark, deep woods. We got back to the car, practically ran to it, got in, locked the doors. Only then did I feel like I could breathe properly again. We drove home in silence. The photo was still on Ben's phone screen like a silent accusation. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing. What was it? What had I seen? What was in that picture? I kept replaying it in my head, the hulking dark shape, the weird patches, the way it moved. A gorilla, it sounded so crazy. But the picture was there. The next day I was a mess. I couldn't concentrate at work. All I could think about was what we'd seen. I kept looking at that photo again and again. Ben was acting weird too. Quieter than usual, kind of preoccupied. He didn't make fun of me anymore, that was for sure. Finally, in the afternoon, I couldn't take it anymore. "Ben, we have to go back," I said. He looked up from his computer, surprised. "Go back? Back to the woods? Clara, why?" Because we have to figure out what that was. I need to know, don't you?" I pleaded. I couldn't stand the uncertainty, the creeping feeling that something was really wrong. He hesitated for a moment, then sighed. "Yeah, I guess. It's driving me nuts too." So we went back. It was daytime this time, bright and sunny, a completely different atmosphere from the evening before. It felt safer in the daylight. But still, that unease was there, hanging in the air. We went back to the trail, to the spot where I had seen it, where Ben had taken the photo. We walked slowly, carefully. We looked down into the woods, trying to see that lower path, to get a better look in the daylight, and then we saw it, down below the trail, not too far from where we'd been standing, hidden a little ways off the path, tucked behind some bushes. There was a big green metal bin, a bear-proof trash container, one of those big industrial-sized ones, the kind they put in parks and campgrounds so bears can't get into the trash. It was taller than me, wide, made of thick metal, and it was scratched up, dented in places, like it had been dragged around, pushed, maybe even climbed on. We stared at it. Just stared. My heart sank a little. This was it? This was the big mystery? A trash can? Ben walked down to it, went closer. He circled it, examining it. He pointed to some marks on the side, long, dark streaks. "Look at this," he said, like something rubbed up against it. Dark stuff. And then I noticed something else, the color of the container. It was green, but in places, especially where it was scratched and rubbed underneath the green paint, it was black. And in certain lights, reflecting the sunlight, those black patches did look kind of bald. We stood there for a long time looking at that trash bin. Could it be? Could what I saw, what was in the photo, could it just have been a trash container? A big, green, scratched-up trash container? It was ridiculous. And yet, in the fading light of dusk, seen from a distance, in the shadows of the trees, maybe, if someone was also walking around nearby, maybe in dark clothes, maybe my brain had just put it all together wrong, a trick of the light, shadows, suggestion. Maybe it was just a weird, unfortunate combination of things that made me see a gorilla where there was only a trash bin and maybe a person in dark clothes by it. The bald patches, just scratched off paint on a green bin. Logically, rationally, it made sense. It was the most likely explanation. We wanted to believe it. We really did. We spent the rest of the afternoon convincing ourselves that's what it was. A perfectly normal, perfectly boring explanation. A trash can. But there's still this feeling. Even now, months later, writing this down, there's this cold knot in my stomach. Because even though I know, logically it could have been the trash container, there are things that don't fit. The way it moved. It wasn't just standing still. It was moving. And it wasn't like a person moving, it was heavier, lumbering, like an animal, like something bigger and more primal. And the size. That trash container is big, yeah, but it's not that big. Not as big as what I saw. What I saw was massive, hulking, more gorilla-sized than trash can-sized. And then there's the photo, that blurry, dark shape in the picture. It kind of looks like the trash bin, yes, in a blurry, indistinct way, but it also still kind of looks like something else, something darker, something more organic. We went back to Mirror Lake a few times after that. We hiked that trail again. We even went back around dusk, just to see if we could see anything else. We never did. Everything was normal, peaceful, quiet, just the woods, the lake, the usual sounds of nature, no gorillas, just trees and shadows and, yeah, that big green trash container down in the woods. But I still can't shake it. That image, that feeling, the cold, creeping dread that went through me when I saw it in the picture. The way Ben reacted. Even he, Mr. Rationale, was freaked out for a while. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I think about it again. I think about that dark shape in the woods, and I wonder, what if it wasn't the trash can? What if it was something else? Something that was really there, in the whispering woods near Mirror Lake that night. Something we couldn't explain, something that was just there. I know it sounds crazy, and I know everyone's going to say it was just shadows, or my imagination, or a trash can. And maybe they're right. Probably they are, but I saw what I saw, and I felt what I felt, and I still get the chills thinking about it. There's still this tiny, nagging voice in the back of my head that whispers, what if it wasn't just a trash can? And that voice scares me more than anything, because I honestly don't know what else it could have been. And I don't think I ever will. And that's the part that really gets to me, just not knowing. So sees Story 6. I still can't really shake it off, you know? It's been months, almost a year now, and it pops into my head at the weirdest times. Like I'll be in the middle of a surgery, completely focused, scalpel in hand, and then bam! It's right there, that image. Cold lake, grey sky, and that thing. It was March, late March, so still pretty brutal up in Glacier. I was driving back from a clinic up near Polebridge. Beautiful country, don't get me wrong. But in the winter, especially out that way, you really feel cut off from the world. Just you and the snow and those huge mountains looming over everything. I love it, I really do, but that day it felt different. The air was heavy, even for a cold day. You know that kind of silence where even the wind seems to hold its breath? That was it. I remember checking my rearview mirror a lot, not because I felt like I was being followed or anything, just that feeling of being utterly alone. My buddy Mark was driving maybe 10 minutes behind me. We'd gone up together for a supply run, but we split up to visit different clinics. Knowing he was back there was some comfort. But out there, 10 minutes feels like a lifetime. Especially when the shadows start getting long. The road was mostly clear, surprisingly. County trucks do a decent job even in the backcountry, but there were still patches of ice, slick as glass. You had to take it slow. That's probably why I saw it, honestly. If I'd been rushing, maybe I would have missed it entirely, and maybe that would have been for the best. I was rounding this bend, you know, the one just past Lake Cume? It's a wide open stretch. The lake to your left, woods rising up on the right. The lake was completely frozen over, blanketed in snow. The light was that flat pre-dusk light, everything washed out, grey sky meeting white snow at the horizon. Just bleak. Beautiful bleak, if that makes sense. And then I saw it. At first I wasn't sure what I was seeing. It was far out on the lake, maybe halfway across. Just a dark shape against the white. My first thought, honestly, was a moose. They get out on the ice sometimes. Dumbest things in the world, moose. But even from that distance, I knew it wasn't right. Too tall, too thin, not moose-shaped at all. I slowed down, squinting. The light was bad, reflecting off the snow, making it hard to focus. But as I got closer, the shape started to resolve. And the more it resolved, the more my stomach started to clench. It was walking on two legs, human-like, but not. It was tall, impossibly tall. I'm 6 feet even, and this thing made me feel like a kid. 7, maybe 8 feet easy, maybe even taller. It was hard to judge distance out on the ice like that, but it was big and skinny, not muscular, just elongated. And the arms, Jesus, the arms. They hung down past its knees, I swear to God, past its knees. They were just dangling there, swinging as it walked, way out of proportion to its body. It wasn't walking normally either. It was more of a shuffle, a long, loping stride, but not smooth, jerky almost, like it wasn't quite comfortable on two legs. It looked dark, covered, like fur maybe, or hair. I couldn't really tell from that distance. It wasn't wearing clothes, that was for damn sure. Just dark, shaggy, and impossibly tall, walking out on the frozen lake. My mind was racing. Bear? No, bears don't walk like that, and not that tall, not even grizzlies on their hind legs. Human? No freaking way. No human walks like that, no human is built like that. And in March, on a frozen lake, dressed like nothing? Absolutely not. And then I saw the dog. Yeah, a dog. Trotting along behind it, maybe 50, 60 feet back. Just a regular-sized dog, looked like maybe a lab or something similar, and it wasn't barking, wasn't aggressive, just following, casually following this thing. That's when the real chill hit me. Not just the cold air, but a coldness deep in my bones. Because dogs react to things that are off. They bark, they growl, they get agitated. But this dog was just there. Like it was completely normal for a 7-foot-tall, hairy, long-armed thing to be walking across a frozen lake in the middle of nowhere. I wanted to stop, I really did. I wanted to pull over, grab my binoculars from the back and get a better look. But my foot stayed glued to the accelerator. I just couldn't stop. There was something about it, something profoundly unsettling that just kept me moving. My heart was pounding. I could feel it hammering in my chest, hear it in my ears. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see, I don't even know what. Something else? More of them? I kept watching the figure in my side mirror as I drove. It just kept walking. Same weird, shuffling gait, same dangling arms. The dog was still trailing behind, a little dark speck against the white. I got my cell phone out, fumbled with it to turn on the camera. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I zoomed in as much as I could, trying to get a picture, but the image on the screen was blurry, pixelated. Just a dark, indistinct blob. No way anyone would believe it was anything. I tried to take a video, but my hands were shaking too much. It was useless. Frustratingly, utterly useless. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. I blinked, looked again. Gone. The lake was empty. Just white snow and flat grey light. The dog, too, vanished, like they'd just dissolved into the landscape. I kept driving, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen, trying to rationalize it. Shadows, tricks of the light, some weird, deformed person wandering around in the wilderness. None of it made sense. Not really. Especially not the dog. That damn dog. Just following along like it was the most normal thing in the world. A few minutes later, Mark called, just a casual check-in, asking how my clinic visit went. I tried to sound normal, tried to keep my voice steady, but I could hear it shaking just a little. "Hey," he said, "everything okay? You sound a bit off." Yeah, fine," I lied. "Just long day, tired, you know." He chuckled. "Tell me about it. Hey, you passed Lake Cume yet?" And that's when it just spilled out. I couldn't hold it in any longer. "Mark," I said, my voice cracking a little. "Mark, I think I just saw something really weird. Really, really weird." I told him everything I'd seen. The tall figure, the long arms, the shuffling walk, the dog. I even said the words out loud, the words that had been forming in the back of my mind ever since I first saw it. "Mark," I said, "it looked like Bigfoot. If Bigfoot was real, that's what it would look like." There was silence on the other end of the line, a long, heavy silence. I could hear the static on the call, the hum of the highway in the background, but no Mark. Finally, he spoke. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "Miles, you're kidding, right?" "No, man," I said, my voice urgent. "I'm serious. I know how it sounds. Crazy. But I swear to God, Mark, I saw something out there on that lake. Something I can't explain." Okay, just tell me exactly what you saw again," he said, his voice still quiet. He was taking me seriously. I could hear it in his tone. I went through it again, detail by detail. The height, the arms, the fur, the walk, the dog, everything. And as I talked, the memory became more vivid, more real. The fear started creeping back in, that icy dread in my gut. When I finished, Mark was quiet again for a long time. Then he said, "Miles, I'm maybe 2 miles behind you, just coming up to Lake Cume now. Pull over and wait for me." I didn't argue. I just pulled over to the side of the road, put the truck in park, and waited. The engine ticked as it cooled down, the silence of the woods pressing in around me. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like whatever I'd seen out there was still watching, still out there somewhere in the trees. It felt like forever before I saw Mark's headlights in my rearview mirror. He pulled up behind me, got out of his truck, and walked over to my window. He looked pale, worried. "You okay?" he asked. I shook my head. "No, man, I'm really not. Did you see anything?" He hesitated for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I saw something." My heart leaped. "You did? You saw it too?" He nodded again. "Yeah, from the road. Just a dark shape out on the lake. Way out there. Couldn't make out any details, really. Just something moving." He hadn't seen it as clearly as I had. He hadn't seen the height, the arms, the dog. But he'd seen something. Something unusual enough to register. Something that made him uneasy. We stood there by the side of the road for a while, staring out at the empty lake. The light was fading fast now, the shadows stretching long across the snow. The air was getting colder, the silence deeper. We didn't see anything else, just the frozen lake, the snow-covered woods, and the darkening sky. We talked about it for a while, trying to make sense of it. We talked about moose, bears, maybe just some weird hiker in a furry costume, but none of it fit. None of it felt right. We ended up just getting back in our trucks and driving the rest of the way home in silence. We didn't talk about it again for weeks, maybe months. It was just this unspoken thing hanging between us. I've told a few people about it since. My wife, a couple of friends. They all look at me like I'm crazy, like I imagined it or dreamt it, or maybe just had too much caffeine that day. They try to be polite, but I can see it in their eyes. They don't believe me. And honestly, sometimes, late at night when I'm lying in bed in the dark, I start to wonder if maybe I didn't imagine it too. If maybe it was just the light and the shadows and my own tired mind playing tricks on me. But then I remember the dog. That dog, just trotting along, so calm, so accepting. And then I know I didn't imagine it. I saw something out there on that lake. Something real, something else. And I still don't know what it was. I probably never will. And that's the part that really gets to you, you know? Not just the fear, but the not knowing. The constant question mark hanging over everything. What was that thing? And what the hell was it doing out there on that frozen lake? Sometimes I think about going back, driving out to Lake Cume again, just to look, to see if I can find anything. Tracks, maybe? Something, anything to confirm what I saw. But then I think about that cold, empty lake, that grey, flat light, and that thing walking across the ice, and I just can't. I can't bring myself to go back there. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Because whatever it was I saw out there, it was something that was never meant to be seen. And maybe some questions are better left unanswered, some mysteries better left unsolved, some doors are better left closed. Because opening them, sometimes you just find something on the other side that you can never unsee. And you're left standing there, staring into the darkness, wondering what in God's name you just stumbled into. And you're alone, completely alone, with nothing but the chill of the wind, the endless white of the snow, and the memory of that thing walking on the ice. And that's it. That's all I know. And honestly, sometimes I wish I could just forget the whole damn day ever happened. But you don't forget something like that. You just live with it, knowing there are things out there that we don't understand, things that maybe we're not supposed to understand. And that, in itself, that's probably the scariest part of all. Story 7. Okay, so this is going to sound crazy. I still don't really know how to talk about it, and honestly, I haven't really told anyone outside of my family, but I saw this thing online, and it reminded me and, well, here goes. It was summer. Must have been back when I was maybe 10, 11. Hot as hell, you know, that East Texas summer heat that just sticks to you and makes you sweat even when you're sitting still. School was out, and all I could think about was this mini bike my dad said he'd try to get me if he could find a good deal. Every day was about asking him if he'd checked, if he'd found anything. Kids, right? That's all we cared about back then. Bikes, games, junk food. Didn't have a worry in the world, or at least I thought I didn't. Dad, Caleb, he wasn't much for talking. Real quiet guy, worked with his hands, knew how to fix anything, build anything, grew up out in the country himself. He always drilled it into me about being ready for anything, especially when you were out in the woods or fields. "Never go out there unarmed, Ethan," he'd say. "You never know what's out there." He'd say it so serious, like it wasn't just about snakes or wild hogs. He'd always make me carry at least a .22 if I was going further than the yard. Seemed a bit much to me back then, but Dad wasn't the kind of guy you argued with. That afternoon, he told me we had to go out to the far pasture to check on the cattle. We'd had some fences down from a storm the week before, and he wanted to make sure everything was still okay. Far pasture was way out, down by the Sulphur River, kind of a spooky place even in daylight, thick woods right up to the edge of the field, and the river itself was always muddy and moving slow. We were loading up the truck, and Blue, our old hound dog, started acting weird. Blue was a coon dog, real brave, wouldn't back down from anything. But he was pacing around the truck, whimpering, tail tucked down, but also trying to growl, like he was confused or scared, or both. I remember looking at Dad, and he just frowned and said, "Get in the truck, Ethan." The drive out there felt longer than usual. The sun was starting to go down, making everything look longer and darker. Dust was kicking up behind the truck as we bumped along the dirt track. I was still thinking about that mini bike, but Blue's weird behavior was in the back of my mind too. He was still whining softly in the back of the cab. When we got to the gate of the pasture, the air felt different. Heavy, still, almost like it was holding its breath. The normal sounds of crickets and cicadas seemed quieter, muffled. Dad stopped the truck and reached behind the seat. He pulled out his rifle, an old lever-action .30-30. That was his deer rifle. He usually only took that out during hunting season. I asked him, "Dad, what's wrong?" He checked the rifle, working the lever to load around, and just said, "Something ain't right, just stay close to me, Ethan." His voice was tight, not his usual calm, steady tone. That's when I really started to feel uneasy. If Dad was worried, it was serious. We got out, and Blue stayed right at our heels, practically glued to Dad's leg. He kept looking out towards the tree line, ears perked up, then back at us, whining and this low, rumbling growl bubbling in his chest. The pasture was big, mostly grass with scattered clumps of trees. The woods ran along one whole side of it, thick and dark green, even in the fading light. We started walking towards the cattle, which were bunched up closer to the far side of the field than usual. They seemed restless too, moving around more than they normally did when we came to check on them. They kept looking towards the woods, just like Blue was doing. And then I heard it. It started as a low growl, deeper than any dog I'd ever heard, deeper than a bear. More like a rumble, like something huge moving around in its chest. It was coming from the woods. Then it got louder, turning into a guttural roar, a sound that just went right through you, vibrating in your bones. It wasn't an animal sound, not like anything I'd ever heard on TV or in the woods before. It was wrong, like something angry and ancient. I froze. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Everything went cold, even though it was still hot and sticky out. I grabbed Dad's leg, squeezing it tight. He didn't even flinch. He just went completely still, rifle raised, pointing towards the edge of the trees. He whispered, "Stay behind me, Ethan. Don't move. Don't make a sound." His voice was strained, like he was holding his breath. The roaring stopped for a second, and there was just this thick silence, broken only by Blue's whimpering, which sounded pathetic all of a sudden, and my own ragged breathing. Then branches started breaking in the woods, not just little twigs, but big branches snapping like they were nothing. Something big was moving in there, fast, and then it stepped out of the tree line. It was huge. I mean, bigger than anything I could have imagined, taller than the truck, easily. It walked upright on two legs, but it wasn't like a man. It was covered in hair, dark, matted hair, all over. Its arms were long, too long, reaching down almost to its knees. They swung as it moved, clumsy but fast. It was bulky, heavy, muscled underneath all that hair, like a bear but standing up. But wrong. Everything about it was wrong. The smell hit me then. God, the smell! Like rotten meat and wet dog, but 100 times stronger. It made my stomach churn. I almost threw up right there. It stopped at the edge of the woods, just standing there looking at us. It had a head, sort of, but it was sunk down into its shoulders, no real neck to speak of. I couldn't see its face clearly in the dim light, but I could see two eyes, dark and shiny, reflecting what little light was left in the sky, just staring at us, watching. It stood there for what felt like forever, maybe only seconds, I don't know. Everything was moving in slow motion and in fast motion at the same time. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but there was no sense to be made. This wasn't supposed to be real. Things like this didn't exist. Then it moved. Not towards us, but sideways, along the tree line. It moved fast, faster than something that big should have been able to move. It just melted back into the trees. No more snapping branches, just silence again. But now it was a different kind of silence, a heavy, waiting silence. Dad slowly lowered the rifle, but he kept it ready, pointing towards the woods. He took a deep breath, and I could see his hand shaking a little, just a little, but enough. Dad never shook. He looked down at me, his face pale in the fading light. He put his hand on my shoulder, grip tight. "Did you see that, Ethan?" he whispered, his voice still rough. I could only nod, my throat too tight to speak. I just kept staring at the woods, expecting it to come crashing out again at any second. He pulled me closer to him, keeping me behind him. "That," he said, his voice still hushed, "that was one of the wild men." Wild men? I didn't understand. What wild men? Like cavemen? That didn't make any sense. He saw the look on my face. "My grandma," he said, still whispering, "my grandma used to tell stories about things in the woods, big, hairy things. Wild men, she called them. Said they'd been here since before the white man, living out in the deep woods, keeping to themselves. I always thought they were just stories, old wives' tales." He looked back at the tree line, his eyes wide. Not like I'd ever seen him before, not calm and sure anymore, but scared. Truly scared. And that scared me even more than the thing in the woods had, because Dad wasn't scared of anything. We stood there for a long time, just listening, barely breathing. Blue was still whimpering at our feet, nudging Dad's leg with his nose. The sun had almost completely gone down now, and it was getting properly dark. Dad finally said, "We gotta go. Now. We ain't feeding the cattle tonight. We're going home." He didn't look at the cattle, didn't even glance at them, just turned around and started walking quickly back towards the truck, me stumbling to keep up behind him, Blue still right there. We practically ran back to the truck, Dad still carrying the rifle, still looking over his shoulder at the woods every few seconds. Got in the truck, doors slammed shut. Dad started it up, tires spitting gravel as he turned it around, and tore out of that pasture like we were being chased by demons. We didn't talk much on the drive home. Blue finally settled down in the back, but he was still restless, shifting around, sighing. I was just staring out the window, seeing that image of the thing burned into my mind. Hairy, huge, those dark eyes in the dusk. When we got back to the house, Mom was on the porch, looking worried. She saw our faces, Dad's especially, and she knew something was wrong. She didn't say anything until we were inside, the door locked and bolted. Dad told her what we saw. He told her about the wild man, about Grandma's stories. Mom turned pale too. She'd heard the stories too, growing up around here. Everyone had, in a way, whispered stories about things in the woods, but you never really believed them. Not really. That night, I didn't sleep in my own room. I slept on the floor in Mom and Dad's room. I needed to be close to them. I kept waking up, hearing noises outside. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves sounded like it was back, coming for us. Dad kept the rifle by the bed that night, and for a long time after that. He started carrying it any time he went outside, even just to the barn. He wouldn't go back to the far pasture for weeks, and when he finally did, he took a bigger rifle, a .30-06, and he made sure he wasn't alone. We never saw it again. Not for real, not like that. But things changed after that day. The woods didn't feel the same anymore. The dark didn't feel the same. Every shadow looked a little bit different. Every strange sound made you jump. You started to think about things that you never thought about before, things that are out there, hidden, things you don't understand. And sometimes late at night, when the wind is blowing through the trees and making them sound like they're whispering, I still think about that sound, that roar, and that huge dark shape at the edge of the woods, and I wonder if it's still out there, watching, waiting. And I remember what Dad said about always being prepared, because you just never know what's out there. I still don't. I just know I saw something that day, something real, and I'll never forget it. Never. Story 8. It was winter 2001. I remember it so clearly, the biting cold that just gnawed right through you. My boy Mateo and I were driving from Boise down to Medford. Long haul. I'm a road warrior, always have been. Trucking is in my blood, and I guess I passed it on to Mateo, even if he's more into the books these days. But back then, he loved riding with me, especially on the open road. We were making good time, or so I thought, until the snow started coming down. Not just a dusting, mind you, but the kind that just blankets everything, makes the road slick as ice. We were somewhere in the South Cascades, and night was really settling in. That deep black winter night that just swallows up the light. Around Union Creek, I needed to pull over. Nature's call, plain and simple. Found this rest area, and I'm using the term rest area loosely. It was more like a wide spot on the side of the road. No lights, no buildings, nothing. Just a couple of picnic tables buried under snow and a pit toilet that looked like it hadn't been cleaned since the Reagan administration. But hey, desperate times, right? I pulled the rig over, engine idling, headlights cutting twin tunnels through the falling snow. "Stay put, mijo," I told Mateo, reaching for my door handle. He was engrossed in his Game Boy, that brick of a thing. "Be right back." As soon as I stepped out, the cold hit me like a slap. It was the kind of cold that seeps into your bones, makes your breath catch in your throat. And the silence, man, that's what got to me first. Not just quiet, but a dead, absolute silence. No wind whistling, no crickets chirping, nothing. Just the soft hiss of the snow falling and the rumble of my idling truck. I started walking towards the trees, figuring to find a little privacy. But even in those few steps away from the truck's headlights, the darkness closed in fast. It wasn't just the lack of light. It was thick, like you could feel it pressing against you. And then it hit me. This feeling. I've been around long enough to trust my gut, and my gut was screaming at me. It was like every hair on my body stood on end. That primal fear, you know? The one that tells you you're being watched, even when you can't see anything. I stopped walking, scanning the trees. Nothing, just shadows and snow. Probably just a deer, I muttered to myself, trying to shake off the feeling. But it wasn't a deer feeling, it was darker than that. I did my business, quick as I could, wanting to get back to the warmth of the cab. As I was turning back towards the truck, that's when I saw them. At first, I wasn't sure what I was looking at. in the darkness beyond the headlights, maybe 50, 60 yards away, out in that open area between the trees and the road. Shapes, tall, thin shapes, moving in a way that just didn't feel right. They weren't like animals. They weren't like people either. They were too tall, too angular. And the way they moved, it was jerky, almost spastic, like they were all elbows and knees and sharp corners. My blood ran cold, like ice water in my veins. I squinted, trying to make sense of it, my breath clouding in front of my face. As they moved closer, out of the deeper shadows, I started to make out details. And that's when the real fear clamped down on me, squeezing the air out of my lungs. They were skeletal. That's the only word for it. Like someone had taken a human body and stretched it out, thinned it down, and then stripped away all the flesh. I could see bone, or what looked like bone, under skin that was stretched tight and grey. Their limbs were too long, their joints knobby and wrong, and their heads. I could only catch glimpses in the dim light, but they were elongated, faces narrow, and their eyes, Jesus, their eyes. Even from that distance I could see they were wide, black, and they reflected the little light there was like polished obsidian. They were moving erratically, not in a pack like wolves, but scattered, darting and weaving as they came closer, and they were fast. Faster than anything natural. It was like they were gliding over the snow, barely disturbing it. And there was more than one, a lot more. I couldn't get an exact count, but at least 5 or 6, maybe more. And they were all coming in our direction. My mind went blank for a split second, just pure, unadulterated terror. Then instinct took over. My truck. Mateo. Got to get back to the truck. I started backing away slowly, never taking my eyes off them. They were getting closer now, and I could hear them. Not vocalizations, not barking or growling, but a rustling sound, like dry leaves skittering across pavement, multiplied, amplified. And something else, a clicking, like bone on bone, or maybe teeth chattering, but too rhythmic, too constant to be just shivering. I reached the driver's side door, fumbling for the handle. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely grip it. Opened the door and practically dove into the cab. "Mateo!" I yelled, my voice rough, adrenaline surging. "Get down, now!" He looked up from his game, startled. "Dad? What's wrong?" "No time to explain. Get on the floor, under the dash. Hurry!" He didn't argue, bless his heart. He's always been a good kid. He dropped the Game Boy and scrambled down onto the floorboard, tucking himself as small as he could. I slammed the door shut, fumbling for my keys, my eyes still glued to the rearview mirror. They were closer now, much closer, almost to the edge of the trees. I could see them clearer now, in the spill of the truck's taillights, and they were horrifying. Their bodies were even more gaunt up close, almost translucent in the pale light. I could see the faint outlines of ribs beneath their skin. Their arms were too long, ending in hands with fingers that looked like claws, long and sharp. And their heads. They were like elongated skulls, the skin stretched tight over sharp cheekbones and jaws that seemed too wide. Those eyes, black pits that seemed to suck in the light. And that rustling, clicking sound was louder now, closer. I could hear it even over the idling engine. It was like a chorus of insects, but somehow bone-chillingly wrong. I jammed the key in the ignition, twisted, and the engine roared to life. Put it in drive, foot slamming on the accelerator. The tires spun for a moment on the snow and ice, then caught, and the truck lurched forward. I didn't look back, couldn't. I just kept my foot down, barreling out of that rest area, back onto the highway, looking in the rearview mirror constantly, praying they weren't following. For what felt like forever, I drove like a madman, eyes fixed on the mirror. My heart was hammering in my chest, every nerve screaming. Mateo was still huddled on the floor, quiet as a mouse. After what felt like miles, I finally dared to glance in the mirror again. Nothing. Just the empty, snowy road behind us. Just the darkness and the falling snow. I started to slow down, my hands still gripping the wheel white-knuckled, let out a shaky breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. "Mateo, you okay, mijo?" I asked, my voice hoarse. He peeked up from the floorboard, eyes wide and scared. What was that, Dad?" I didn't know what to tell him. I still don't know. I don't know, son," I said honestly. I don't know." We drove the rest of the way to Medford in silence, a heavy, thick silence that settled over us both. He didn't ask again, and I didn't offer any explanation. What could I say? "Hey, son, remember those skeletal monsters that tried to attack us at that rest stop?" It sounded insane, even to me. We got to my sister's place in Medford late, bone-tired and drained. I told her we'd hit bad weather, had to drive slow, left out the rest. I tucked Mateo into the spare room bed, kissed him goodnight, and went to sit in the living room, staring out into the dark. I haven't told many people about that night. Most folks would think I was crazy, seeing things. Maybe I was. Maybe it was stress, or the cold, or just my imagination running wild in the dark. But I know what I saw. I saw those creatures. I felt that fear. And I'll never forget the way they moved, the sound they made, those black, empty eyes. To this day, I can't drive through a snowy area at night without getting that tightness in my chest, that cold dread creeping up my spine. I avoid rest stops on back roads, especially in winter. And I always check my mirrors when I stop on the side of the road, just for a second, scanning the shadows, half expecting to see those skeletal shapes emerge from the darkness again. I don't know what they were. Some kind of animal. Something else? I have no answers. All I know is something out there in the wilderness is not right. And I pray to God I never see anything like that again. I hope Mateo never does either. We got away that night by the skin of our teeth. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still hear that rustling, clicking sound. And I remember those black eyes staring at us from the dark. And I know deep down that whatever those things were, they were hungry. And we were on the menu. Story 9. It was the summer of '77, and everything just felt different back then, you know. Slower, hotter, and somehow more open like anything could happen. We were out at Lake Alamo, which wasn't really a lake so much as a wide part of a river that got dammed up, making it this long, snaking thing surrounded by trees that were thick and dark, even in the daytime. My cousin Leo was with us, visiting from back east. He was a year older than me, full of bravado, always trying to show off. Then there was Lily, my little sister, tagging along like she always did. She was all curiosity, bright eyes, and questions. We went to this cove. It was our usual spot, quiet, kinda out of the way. Dad had dropped us off at the boat launch earlier with fishing poles and a tackle box that smelled of earthworms and stale crackers. The air was thick with the smell of pine and that damp lake smell, you know, a little fishy, a little earthy. The sun was beating down, making the water shimmer and dance. We were catching bluegill mostly, little sunfish that tugged at the line and looked like tiny, angry pancakes when you pulled them out. It was a good afternoon, easy and lazy, the kind where you just exist and don't really think about anything much at all. Around late afternoon, my parents and my aunt and uncle, Leo's folks, they said they were heading back to the dock, said something about wanting to beat the dinner rush at some diner in town. We could stay a bit longer, they said, and they'd come back for us in the boat later. Seemed normal enough. We were old enough to be left alone, or at least we thought we were. Lily, she got bored with fishing pretty quick. Started complaining, wanting to go see Mom and Dad. She's always been a homebody, even back then. I told her okay, figured I could carry her on my shoulders back up the trail, then Leo and I could come back and fish a little more. Leo, of course, was busy trying to snag a bigger fish, ignoring us. So Lily and I started walking. The trail from the cove wasn't long, maybe 10, 15 minutes at a kid's pace, but it was through the woods, pretty dense. The trees were old and tall, casting long shadows even with the sun still up. It was getting cooler in the shade, the air shifting from that thick summery heat to something a little crisper. I hoisted Lily onto my shoulders, her little hands grabbing onto my hair, and we started down the path. And that's when I heard it. Just a sound at first, but distinct. Footsteps, but not regular footsteps, not like someone walking normally. More like measured, deliberate, heavy, coming from the trees to the side of the path, to my left, deeper in the woods. I stopped, my breath kind of caught in my throat. Lily, she shifted on my shoulders, probably sensed something was off. "What is it, Alex?" she asked, her voice small. I didn't answer her at first. I was listening. The footsteps stopped too. My heart started to beat a little faster. Okay, probably just an animal, right? Deer, maybe? Or some other kind of forest creature moving around. But deer don't usually sound like that. These steps were too heavy, too rhythmic. I started walking again just to see, to test it, I guess. And then I heard it again. The footsteps started too, matching my pace. Step, 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 always from the left, always just out of sight in the thick trees. It was like something was walking with us, keeping pace but hidden. I stopped again. So did the steps. This time I felt a cold prickle on the back of my neck. This wasn't normal. This wasn't an animal. This was something else. Something was watching us. "Alex, you're squeezing me," Lily whispered. I realized I was gripping her legs tighter than I meant to. I loosened my grip a little, but I didn't move. I didn't want to move. I was frozen, listening, trying to see through the trees, but they were too dense, the undergrowth too thick. Just shadows and green. I told Lily, trying to keep my voice calm, even though inside I was starting to freak out a little. "Hey, stay really quiet for a second, okay? Just listen." She nodded, her small body still on my shoulders. We both stood there, silent. The only sounds, the buzzing of insects, the rustle of leaves in the slight breeze, and nothing else. The footsteps were gone. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe it was just my nerves playing tricks. It was quiet out here, you know. Real quiet. And sometimes quiet can get to you, make you hear things that aren't there. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination. I started walking again, a little faster this time. Lily was still quiet, trusting me, as kids do. And for a few steps, nothing. Just the sound of our own feet on the dirt path. I started to feel a little better, a little stupid for getting worked up. Then it came back. Step, step, step. Closer now, definitely closer, and heavier. Each footfall seemed to thump in my chest. This time, there was also a different sound mixed in with the steps. A rustling, a snapping of twigs, like something big was pushing its way through the underbrush. Fear slammed into me. Real fear, the kind that makes your stomach drop and your skin go cold. I didn't care about being brave or cool or whatever. I just wanted to get out of there. I wanted to get back to the boat dock, back to my parents, back to people. I turned around quick, almost stumbling. "Leo!" I yelled, my voice cracking a little. "Leo, come on! Let's go!" No answer, just the buzzing insects, the leaves rustling, and now, much closer, the heavy steps and the snapping branches getting louder, louder. And then I saw it. Just a glimpse at first, through a break in the trees, a flicker of something dark, something big, moving, fast. My breath hitched in my throat. I just stared, paralyzed for a split second. Lily on my shoulders went stiff. Then it pushed through the trees, just burst out right onto the edge of the path, maybe 20 feet away, maybe closer. It was like nothing I'd ever seen. Nothing human, that's for sure. It was huge, taller than any man I'd ever seen, easily 7, 8 feet tall, maybe more. It was covered in thick, dark hair, matted and coarse-looking. Muscles bulged underneath, thick arms, massive legs. It moved on 2 legs, like a person, but it wasn't a person. Its shoulders were broad, hunched, and its arms hung down almost to its knees. And the face, I don't know how to describe the face. It was brutish. Heavy brow, pushed-in nose, wide, thick-lipped mouth. But it was the eyes that got to me. They weren't animal eyes. They were intelligent and angry, dark, reddish-brown, burning, staring right at me. Intense, piercing, like they were looking right through me, seeing everything, judging me. Terror, that's the only word. Pure, raw, paralyzing terror. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't even scream. I just stood there, frozen, staring at this thing. Beside me, closer to the lake, Leo was still fishing, oblivious. He hadn't heard anything, hadn't seen anything. He was focused on his fishing pole, probably thinking about whatever dumb boy stuff he thought about. I managed to croak out one word, just barely. Leo. My voice was thin, reedy, barely audible. He didn't hear me. He was too far, too focused, too unaware. I tried again, louder this time, pointing, my arm shaking so bad I could barely lift it. Leo, look! This time, he heard me. He turned, finally, his fishing pole dropping to the ground. He looked at me, confused for a second. Then he looked past me, at whatever I was pointing at. His eyes went wide. Really, really wide. Wider than I'd ever seen anyone's eyes go. His mouth dropped open, but no sound came out. He just stood there, staring, like he'd seen a ghost. And then he screamed. Not a yell, not a shout, but a high-pitched, piercing scream of pure, unadulterated panic. The kind of scream that rips through the air and makes your blood run cold. And then, without another word, without looking back, he turned and just dove right into the lake, clothes and all. Plunged into the water, disappeared for a second, and then surfaced, sputtering, already swimming as fast as he could towards the boat dock. He was gone, just like that. Left me standing there with that thing. The creature hadn't moved. It was still standing at the edge of the trees, watching us. Watching me. Those eyes, they were locked on me. There was no aggression in its stance, not exactly. But there was intensity, an unnerving, powerful presence that radiated from it. Lily started whimpering on my shoulders, small, terrified sounds. I could feel her trembling. That snapped me out of it just a little. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just stand there and stare. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. Run? Fight? There was no way I could fight that thing. It was too big, too strong. Running, maybe. But where? Back up the trail? Away from the dock, away from help? That seemed like a bad idea. The lake. Leo had jumped in the lake. That was it. Water. Maybe it wouldn't follow us into the water. I turned, still keeping my eye on the creature, and started backing towards the lake. The water was cold on my bare feet, seeping through my sneakers. I waded in, slowly at first, then faster, the water getting deeper, colder, sucking at my legs. I didn't look back. I kept my eyes fixed on the creature, still standing there at the edge of the trees, unmoving, watching. The water was up to my knees now, then my waist, ice cold, stealing my breath. Lily was clinging to me, her face buried in my neck, sobbing softly. I kept backing up further and further into the lake. The water was up to my chest, chilling me to the bone. I could see Leo now, a small dark head bobbing in the distance, getting closer to the dock. He was almost there, and the creature, it was still there, just watching, not moving, not chasing, just watching. Those burning eyes, I could feel them on me, even in the cold water. I was chest deep now, shivering uncontrollably, Lily's sobs muffled against my neck. I was completely out of ideas, completely terrified. I just wanted to disappear. I wished I could just sink beneath the surface of the water and never come back up. And then something happened, something completely unexpected. The creature turned its head. Quickly, sharply, like it had heard something. It looked away from me, away from the lake, and into the woods, back the way we had come, deeper into the forest, away from the boat dock, away from everything. It stood there for a second, its head cocked, listening. Then in a blink it was gone, just vanished. It turned and moved, fast, incredibly fast, disappearing back into the trees, up the slope, away from the cove, away from us. It was like it had been spooked by something further in the woods, something we couldn't see, couldn't hear. 1 second it was there, massive, terrifying, watching me. The next second just empty trees, silence, just the lapping of the water and Lily's quiet whimpers. I stood there for a long time, chest deep in the freezing water, staring at the empty trees, not moving, not breathing, just numb. Lily was still clinging to me, still trembling. I could feel her wet cheek against my neck, feel her little body shaking. Finally I turned and started wading towards the dock, slowly, cautiously, still looking back at the trees every few seconds, expecting it to reappear, expecting it to come crashing out of the woods again. But it didn't. It was gone. When we got to the dock, Leo was already there, huddled on the wooden planks, shivering, wrapped in a towel that my mum had thrown around him. My parents were there too, looking panicked. They'd seen Leo come swimming up, soaking wet and babbling, something about a monster. They were scared, confused, asking questions. Leo couldn't really talk. He was too shaken up, just kept pointing back towards the woods, muttering about something huge and hairy with red eyes. My parents were trying to calm him down, trying to figure out what had happened. I pulled myself and Lily up onto the dock, water streaming off us. My mum rushed over, wrapped a towel around Lily, then another around me. She was asking questions too, her voice tight with worry. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to explain it. Monster, creature. It sounded insane, like something out of a movie. But it was real. I'd seen it. We both had. I told them about the footsteps, about the sound of something following us, about the shadow, about it. I tried to describe it, the size, the hair, the face, those eyes, but the words felt flat, inadequate. They didn't capture the terror, the sheer wrongness of it. My parents listened, their faces growing more and more concerned. They exchanged worried glances. My dad looked towards the woods, his brow furrowed. He didn't dismiss it, not exactly, but he didn't quite believe it either. It was like he wanted to believe us, but couldn't. Later, after we were back home, wrapped in blankets, drinking hot chocolate, still shaking, still cold inside, things started to settle down a little. My parents kept asking questions, gentle questions, trying to piece together what had happened. Leo was quieter now, subdued, staring into his hot chocolate. Lily was asleep, exhausted and still a little tearful. The next day, we went back to the lake, my dad insisted. He wanted to check things out. He brought a friend of his, a big guy named Frank, who knew about hunting and tracking and stuff. They walked the trail, they looked around the cove, they searched the woods. They found nothing. No tracks, no sign of anything unusual. Just the woods, quiet and still. They said it was probably a bear, maybe a big dog, something like that. Just an animal that had scared us. But I knew it wasn't a bear. And it wasn't a dog. It was something else. Something different. We were walking back from the lake, the four of us, quiet, tired, and we passed a couple of hikers coming down the trail. They were older, wearing backpacks and hiking boots, looking like they knew the woods. They smiled at us as they passed. And as they went by, I overheard one of them say to the other, "Yeah, they say there's been Bigfoot sightings in this area for years. Mostly just stories, of course, but you never know." Bigfoot. The word hung in the air, heavy, unsettling. Bigfoot. That's what they called it. That hairy, giant creature that people said lived in the woods, that most people didn't believe in. Bigfoot. Suddenly, it clicked. The size, the hair, the shape, the way it walked on two legs, the reddish-brown eyes. Bigfoot. Maybe that's what it was. Maybe that's what we saw. But even if it was, even if there was a name for it, it didn't make it any less terrifying. It didn't make those burning eyes any less real. It didn't explain why it had just stood there, watching us, and then run away so suddenly. And to this day, I still don't know what we saw that day in the woods by Lake Alamo. I don't know if it was Bigfoot or something else, or just some trick of the light and our scared imaginations. But I know what I saw, I know what Leo saw, and I know that something real, something big and powerful and terrifying was out there in those woods that day, watching us, and I'll never forget the way those reddish-brown eyes looked at me. Never. It's a feeling that just stays with you. A cold, chilling feeling that never really goes away. And sometimes, when it's really quiet at night, and the wind rustles the trees outside my window, I still think I hear them, those heavy, measured footsteps coming closer and closer. Story 10. It's still something that messes with me, you know, even after all this time. I guess you never really shake some things off, no matter how much you try to convince yourself it was just your mind playing tricks. But this felt way too real to be just in my head. It was back in '91, me and my boy Toby. We were living in Gulchwood, California. I'd served my time, you know, in the army. Saw some things over there that I still wish I could forget. But Gulchwood was different. It was supposed to be my escape, my piece of peace. I'd grown up around there. Those woods were practically my backyard as a kid. Always loved being out there, especially Black Ridge Forest. Remembered it being full of these huge pine trees, the kind that dropped those massive pine cones, the ones with the piney nuts inside. Toby was just a little guy then, maybe 6 or 7, something like that. I wanted to share that with him, show him the stuff I loved as a kid. So, one evening, it was a Saturday, I think, I told Toby, "Hey, bud, how about we take a drive up to Black Ridge? Remember those big pine cones I told you about? We can go find some." He was always up for an adventure, my Toby. Kids are like that, ain't they? Everything's exciting. He said, yeah, real enthusiastic, and we hopped in my old pickup. It was late fall, getting close to winter. The days were getting shorter, nights were colder. It was dark already by the time we actually got up to Black Ridge. No moon that night either, just pitch black once you got away from the town lights. I figured we could still find some cones, you know, even in the dark. I had a flashlight in the truck, a good one of those big mag lights. I drove up Black Ridge Road, heading deeper into the forest. It's a narrow, winding road, mostly dirt and gravel once you get past the main paved part. Tall trees right up to the edge of the road on both sides, blocking out any bit of light from anywhere else. It felt different at night, darker and quieter than I remembered. The wind was picking up too, making that whistling sound through the trees, kind of eerie if you're not used to it. I found a spot to pull over. It was just a wide shoulder on the side of the road, enough space to get the truck off the track. I parked facing back towards Gulchwood just in case. I don't know why I did that. Just a gut feeling, maybe. Toby was a bit sleepy already, kind of quiet, looking out the window. "We here, Dad?" he asked, rubbing his eyes. "Yeah, buddy, we're here." "Come on, let's grab that flashlight and see if we can find some of those giant pine cones." We got out of the truck. The air was cold, crisp, smelled like pine and damp earth. That smell, that was familiar. That was the smell of my childhood. For a second, I actually felt good, you know, like maybe I was doing the right thing, bringing Toby here, showing him this. I took the flashlight from the glove box and switched it on. The beam cut through the darkness, a bright white circle in the black. I scanned around, the trees towering over us, their branches swaying in the wind, making these long shadows dance on the ground. The wind was getting stronger now. The trees really started to whisper, that low, constant rustling sound, like the forest itself was talking. We started walking away from the truck, just a few steps into the woods. The ground was covered in pine needles and fallen leaves, crackling under our feet. I pointed the flashlight beam down, searching for pine cones. I started seeing them almost right away, scattered around on the ground. They were big, just like I remembered, some of them as long as my forearm. "Wow, Dad, look at this one," Toby said, his voice a bit hushed, like he was already feeling the quiet of the forest. He picked up a cone, holding it up to the flashlight beam. "It's huge!" "Yeah, those are the ones," I said, smiling. "We used to collect these and roast the nuts inside." I picked up a couple myself. They were heavy, solid. I started feeling that familiar excitement of being out in the woods, hunting for treasures. It was a good feeling. For a while, I just forgot everything else, the bad memories, the worries. It was just me and Toby and the forest and the pine cones. We walked a little further in, deeper into the trees, still following the gentle slope of the hillside. The wind kept whistling, the shadows kept dancing, and that whispering sound from the trees was getting louder, more constant. I started to get that feeling again, that nagging little voice in the back of my head, that feeling that something wasn't quite right, like we weren't alone. I tried to shake it off. Probably just the wind, or some animal in the woods, a deer maybe, or a raccoon. Nothing to worry about. Still, I kept looking around, shining the flashlight into the darker parts between the trees, trying to see if anything was out there. Nothing but trees and shadows. We kept collecting cones, filling up the little plastic grocery bag I brought from the truck. Toby was getting into it, really excited about finding the biggest ones. He was running a few steps ahead of me, pointing his finger at the ground. And then it happened. It started with a sound, not the wind, not the trees, not anything I could recognize at first. It was a low growl, almost like an animal, but deeper, rougher. It was far away at first, distant, coming from up the slope, higher in the woods. I stopped walking, stopped shining the flashlight, just stood still and listened. The growl came again, closer this time. It was definitely animal, no doubt about that. But it was wrong. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard before. It was too deep, too guttural, too angry sounding. It sent a shiver down my spine. Toby stopped too, sensing something was off. He looked back at me, his eyes wide in the darkness, the flashlight beam shaking a little in his hand. "Dad, what's that sound?" I didn't answer him right away. I was listening, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. The wind seemed to die down a little. The forest got even quieter except for that growling sound. It was definitely getting closer, moving down the slope towards us. And then it wasn't a growl anymore. It changed. It turned into a scream, but not like a human scream. More like animal, but still wrong, primal, painful, terrifying. It cut through the silence of the forest like a knife. It was so loud, so sudden, it made my heart jump into my throat. My blood ran cold. Every hair on my arm stood on end. Terror, raw and immediate, just slammed into me. It wasn't like anything I'd felt before, not even in combat. This was different. This was pure, instinctive fear. Toby screamed too, a real human scream this time, scared and confused. He grabbed my leg, holding on tight. "Dad, what is that?" I didn't know what it was. I had no idea. But whatever it was big, and it was close, and it was coming right for us. I could feel it. I could sense it in the air, that primal scream. It wasn't just sound, it was a warning. And then I heard it. Something crashing through the undergrowth, up the slope above us. Heavy, fast, breaking branches, snapping twigs, the sound of something big moving through the trees, getting closer and closer. "Run, Toby," I yelled. "Run back to the truck." I shoved him gently towards the road, pointing him in the direction we came from. He didn't hesitate. He took off like a shot, scrambling back through the trees, the beam of his flashlight bouncing wildly. I turned to face the direction of the sound, holding my own flashlight up, trying to see through the darkness. My heart was pounding in my chest, so loud I could barely hear anything else. My hands were shaking so bad I could hardly hold the flashlight steady. The crashing sound was getting closer, faster. Whatever it was coming down the hill like a freight train. I could hear it breathing now, heavy, ragged breaths. It was close, too close. I dropped the pine cones, let the bag fall to the ground. I wasn't thinking about pine cones anymore. I was just thinking about getting out of there, getting Toby to safety. I started backing away slowly, still facing the direction of the sound, keeping the flashlight beam pointed into the trees, and then I saw it, just for a split second, a flicker of movement in the darkness. Something dark, huge, moving between the trees. I couldn't make out any details. It was too dark, too fast. But it was big, bigger than a man, bigger than a bear. And then it was right there, right at the edge of the trees, just a few yards away from me. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The flashlight beam landed on it, caught it in the light for just a moment. It was hairy, dark, matted hair all over its body. Massive shoulders, hunched over, thick arms. It was standing upright but leaning forward like it was ready to pounce. I couldn't see its face clearly in the shadows, but I saw eyes. 2 eyes, glowing in the darkness, reflecting the flashlight beam like animal eyes, but bigger, brighter, more intense. And then it screamed again, that same terrifying primal scream, but louder this time, right in my face. The sound was deafening. It vibrated in my chest, in my bones. It wasn't just a scream, it was a roar, a challenge, a threat. I didn't think, I just reacted. I turned and ran faster than I'd ever run before, faster than I thought I could run. I ran towards the road, towards the truck, towards Toby, towards any kind of safety. I could hear it behind me, still crashing through the trees, still coming after me. I didn't dare look back. I just kept running, my lungs burning, my legs pumping, fear driving me forward. I burst out of the trees and onto the road, towards the truck. I could see Toby already at the truck, fumbling with the passenger door, trying to open it. He was crying, panicked, shouting my name. "Dad! Dad! Hurry!" I sprinted to the driver's side, fumbling for the keys in my pocket. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip them. I got the key in the lock, yanked the door open, jumped inside. Toby was already in the passenger seat, scrambling to buckle his seatbelt. I slammed the door, shoved the key into the ignition and turned. The engine coughed, sputtered, and then roared to life. Thank God. I slammed it into gear, foot on the gas pedal, and we lurched forward, back down Black Ridge Road. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and I saw it again, standing at the edge of the woods, right where I had just been. In the truck's taillights, I could see it clearly for a moment. Taller now, standing fully upright, dark, hairy, massive, its eyes still glowing in the dark, watching us. It didn't chase us. It just stood there, watching as we sped away, its dark silhouette stark against the trees. It was like it was letting us go, like it had made its point. I didn't stop driving until we were back in Gulchwood, back in town, back under the streetlights. I didn't even slow down. I just kept driving, adrenaline pumping, until I felt like we were far enough away, until I felt like we were safe. I pulled into our driveway, parked the truck, and just sat there for a minute, engine still running, catching my breath. Toby was quiet now, still scared, but quiet. He was staring straight ahead, his face pale. "Dad," he whispered finally. What was that? I looked at him, my own heart still pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to tell him. I didn't know what it was. I'd served in the army, seen combat, seen some messed up things, but I'd never seen anything like that. Never felt that kind of fear. "I don't know, buddy," I said, my voice shaky. "I honestly don't know." We went inside, locked the doors, checked all the windows. We didn't sleep much that night. Every little sound made me jump. Every shadow looked like something lurking just outside. The next morning, when the sun came up, it all felt a little less real, like maybe it had been a nightmare, just a bad dream in the dark woods. I almost started to believe it myself. Almost. But then Toby woke up, and he looked at me with those big, serious eyes. "Dad," he said again, "it was real, right? What we saw in the woods last night. It wasn't just a dream." And I looked at him, at his face, at the fear still lingering in his eyes, and I knew it was real. It was as real as anything I'd ever experienced. "Yeah, Toby," I said. "It was real." I never went back to Black Ridge Forest after that. Not ever. And I never collected pine cones again. Toby, he still remembers it, even now that he's grown up. He doesn't talk about it much, but I know he remembers. He remembers the fear in my eyes, the way I drove like a madman to get us out of there. I've tried to rationalize it, to find some explanation. Bear, mountain lion, something else. But none of it fits. None of it explains the scream, the size, the way it moved, the feeling of pure terror it exuded. To this day, I have no idea what we saw out there in Black Ridge Forest that night, and honestly, I don't think I ever want to know. Some things are better left unknown. Some things are just out there, in the dark, waiting. And that's the kind of thought that can still keep me up at night, even now, all these years later. Story 11. Look, I don't usually talk about this, not to anyone. It's one of those things you just bury, but I saw this thread and something just clicked. Maybe getting it out will help, I don't know. Or maybe just seeing if anyone else has seen anything even remotely close. Probably not. But here goes. It was August of '95, middle of the month. Me and Maggie, my wife, we were trucking coast to coast like we always did. This time we were on the California coast, Highway 1. Beautiful, yeah, usually. But this night, rolling into Crestfall, it was nasty. Storm was brewing, sky was this angry, bruised purple, wind was whipping off the ocean, making the truck rock even on the highway. Rain was coming down in sheets, couldn't see 5 feet in front of you. We were tired, bone-tired from days on the road, pushing hard to make our delivery in Sacramento. We decided, screw it, let's just find a motel, any motel, and sleep this storm off. Crestfall Marina. Sounded nice, right? Turned out to be anything but. We found this place, the Crestfall Marina Inn. Decent enough, I guess, on the surface. Run down, yeah. Definitely seen better days, but clean sheets and a roof, that's all we needed. Overlooked the marina, or what we could barely see of it through the rain-lashed windows. Gloomy was an understatement. We grabbed some lukewarm diner food from the place next door, soggy fries, rubbery burger, the kind of stuff you eat because you're hungry, not because you enjoy it. Went back to the room, flipped on the TV, nothing but static and late-night preachers. Maggie was out like a light before 10. Me, I'm used to sleeping in the cab, used to the rumble and the road, so motel beds, they're like heaven for me. Still, I'm a light sleeper, always have been. Next morning, I'm up before the sun, always am. Old trucker habits die hard, you know. Grabbed a coffee from the machine in the lobby. Tasted like burnt plastic, but caffeine's caffeine. Maggie was still dead to the world, snoring softly. Figured, why not? Stretch my legs a bit before we hit the road again. Keys to the rental were right there on the nightstand. Quietly slipped out, hopped in the car, some beat-up Ford Taurus we'd rented back in LA. Road was still wet from the night's rain, but the storm had moved on. Sky was just starting to get that pre-dawn glow, not quite light, not quite dark. Drove south on the 101, just cruising. Figured I'd wake Maggie up in an hour or so, grab some proper breakfast somewhere down the line. Wasn't really paying attention to where I was going, just enjoying the quiet, the stillness after the storm. Then I saw it. Off to the side of the road, this stretch of beach, just black. Black sand, weirdest thing, never seen anything like it. Against the pale sky, it looked otherworldly. Pulled over without really thinking about it. Parked on the shoulder, engine idling, stared at the beach. It was empty, desolate, just black sand, stretching down to the grey, choppy water. Thought maybe Maggie would like to see it. Something different. Maybe snap a picture even though the light was still crap. Turned in my seat to look back at her, see if she was still sleeping. And that's when I saw it. Right there, in front of the windshield. At first, honestly, my brain just short-circuited. Tried to make sense of what I was seeing. It was big, blocking out most of the windshield. Brownish dark, hairy. My first thought, For a split second, and I swear to God this is true, my first thought was, bear. Stupid, I know, but that's what flashed through my mind. Bear. In California. On the beach? Something wasn't adding up. Then my brain kicked back in. It wasn't a bear, not even close. It was standing, upright, like a person, but not too tall. Way too tall. 7 feet, easy, maybe more. Towering over the hood of the car, covered in hair. Not fur like a bear, more like matted, tangled, stringy hair. Dark brown, almost black in the dim light. It wasn't uniform either. Clumps and mats like it hadn't been cleaned, combed, ever. And the smell. Jesus Christ, the smell. It hit me even through the closed windows. This rank, putrid stench. Like rotting seaweed, yeah, but mixed with something else. Something animalistic. Foul. Made my stomach churn instantly. It was holding something. In its hands. Clawed hands. Long fingers, thick claws, darker than the hair, almost black. It was holding this clump of seaweed, big dripping mass of kelp, like it had just pulled it right out of the ocean, holding it like a trophy or a weapon. I don't know. Its head. That was the worst part. No snout like a bear, flatter face, receding forehead, and the eyes. I can still see those eyes. Burning red. Glowing, looking right at me, pure rage, just burning, hateful rage in those eyes. And something else, something cold, something ancient. It was staring right through the windshield, right at me, and it moved, took a step, closer to the car. I could see the muscles under the matted hair, bunching, moving, power, raw, unbelievable power. And then it opened its mouth. Not to roar, not to growl, just opened it, wide, too wide, and this thick, stringy stuff started drooling out like mucus, dark green, slimy mucus, and it started spitting, hocking loogies right onto my windshield, this thick, stinking slime, mixed with something else. I think it was saliva, or worse. It was spraying all over the glass, splattering, running down in streaks, and with every spit this guttural sound, deep, rumbling, from its chest, like a growl, but deeper, more primal, more threatening. I was frozen, just staring, stuck in place, heart hammering against my ribs, mouth dry, couldn't breathe, couldn't move, just staring at this thing, this monster. It was right in front of me, maybe a foot from the windshield. I could see every detail of its face, the matted hair around its jaw, the thick lips pulled back in a snarl, showing these yellowed teeth. Not human teeth, too long, too sharp. And the eyes, still locked on me, burning red hate, and something else. Hunger, curiosity, I don't know. It felt alien, completely and utterly alien. Then another sound, coming from behind me down the highway, headlights, car coming fast, getting closer. The creature, it shifted, turned its head slightly, not away from me completely, just angled, still watching me, but aware of the other car now. The car behind me, it must have seen it too. Seen this thing standing in the middle of the road, brakes screeched, tires locked up, skidding on the wet asphalt, horn blared, loud, long blast, cutting through the morning quiet. The creature, it didn't flinch, didn't jump, just stood there, massive, immovable, watching both me and the other car now. But the sound, it snapped me out of it, broke the paralysis. Panic flooded through me, pure, raw terror. I didn't think, I didn't analyze, I just reacted. Foot slammed on the gas, tires spun for a second on the gravel shoulder, car lurched forward, jolted back onto the highway. I didn't look back, didn't check if the creature moved, didn't care about the other driver, the one who'd slammed on his brakes and blared his horn. Just drove as fast as I could, north, away from that beach, away from that thing. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely grip the steering wheel. Heart was still pounding like a drum solo, breathing coming in ragged gasps. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see something, chasing me, but nothing, just empty road behind me. Didn't stop driving until I was miles away, miles and miles. Finally pulled over at a gas station, hands still trembling. Coffee, I needed coffee, and cigarettes, even though I'd quit years ago. Found a crumpled pack in the glove box, lighter too. Hands still shaking so bad I almost couldn't light it. Sat there in the parking lot smoking, drinking the gas station coffee, trying to calm down, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Bear? No, not a bear. Nothing like a bear. Something else. Something impossible. After a while, Maggie woke up, stretched, yawned. "Where'd you go?" she asked, all sleepy and groggy. "Just a drive," I said, voice sounding strained even to my own ears. "Get some air." Didn't look at her. Couldn't meet her eyes. We got back on the road, drove in silence for a while. Maggie was humming to the radio, oblivious. I kept replaying it in my head. The hairy thing, the red eyes, the smell, the spit. It felt like a dream, a nightmare, but it was real. I knew it was real. The stink of it was still in my nostrils. The image burned into my brain. Then, after about an hour, we were coming up to a junction, and I saw a car pulled over on the side of the road, just ahead of us. Jeep Cherokee, dark green, looked familiar. Then I realized it was the car from behind me, the one that had honked. Driver was standing next to it, looking shaken, pacing back and forth, saw us coming and just stood there, watching us approach. As we got closer, he just raised his hand, just a small, hesitant wave, like he recognized us, or the car. I pulled over, didn't even think about it, just pulled over right behind his Jeep. Maggie looked at me, surprised. "What's wrong?" she asked. "Car trouble." "Just hang on a sec," I said, and got out. Walked over to the Jeep driver. He was maybe in his late 30s, early 40s, pale, sweating even in the cool morning air, eyes wide, pupils blown wide open, like he'd seen a ghost, or worse. He looked at me and just nodded, slowly, like he understood, like he knew exactly what I was going to say, or what I wasn't going to say. "You saw it too, didn't you?" I said, voice barely above a whisper. He just nodded again, eyes still wide, fixed on mine. "On the beach," he whispered back. "That thing." "Yeah," I said, "the beach, that thing." Didn't need to say more. We both knew. We both saw it. We stood there for a minute, just looking at each other, no words, just this shared understanding, this bond born out of terror. Then he spoke again, voice still low, shaky. Did anyone else?" He trailed off. "Don't think so," I said. "Just us, I guess." He nodded. Again. And then he said, We shouldn't tell anyone, should we?" I knew what he meant. Who would believe us? Crazy truckers seeing monsters on the beach. We'd be laughed out of town, maybe worse, maybe locked up. "No," I said, "no, we shouldn't." He just looked at me, this pleading look in his eyes. "Promise," he whispered. "Promise," I said. "Swear, we don't say a word to anyone." We shook hands, firm, hard handshake, a pact of silence, bound by fear. Maggie got out of the car then, curious. "Jake, what's going on? Everything okay?" We both turned to look at her, smiling, forced, fake smiles. "Yeah, honey, everything's fine," I said. Just helping this guy out. He had a little trouble with his car." Lied straight to her face. First lie of many I knew. "You sure?" she asked, still looking worried. "Positive," I said. "Let's get back on the road, huh?" We got back in the car. The Jeep driver got back in his Jeep. We both drove off in opposite directions, just like that, never saw him again, never knew his name. Just the Jeep driver, the other witness, the only other person in the world who knew what I knew, what we both knew. We never spoke of it again, me and Maggie, not to each other, not to anyone. We kept our promise, the silent pact. But it changed things between us, between me and Everything. I think about it all the time, every day, especially when I'm driving along the coast. I look at the ocean, at the beaches, always looking, searching for something, for confirmation, for proof that I wasn't crazy, that it wasn't just a hallucination, that it was real, that hairy thing on the black sand beach in Crestfall. Sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, I think about that Jeep driver. Wonder if he's still out there. Wonder if he thinks about it too. Wonder if he ever breaks the pact, or if he's still silent, like me. I wish I knew his name. I wish I could talk to him, just once. Just to know that I wasn't alone, that someone else saw it too, that I didn't just imagine it all. Because sometimes I almost start to believe that maybe I did. That maybe it was just the storm, the early morning, the lack of sleep. Maybe my mind just made it up, played a trick on me. But then I remember the smell, and the red eyes, and the spit on the windshield. And I know it was real. And I still have no idea what it was, or what it wanted, or why it was there. And that's the part that really gets to me. The not knowing, the emptiness, the feeling that there's something out there, something ancient and unknown, lurking just out of sight, just beyond the edge of what we understand. And I saw it, for a moment, on a black sand beach in Crestfall, and I'll never forget it. Never. Story 12. Man, summer of '69, you wouldn't believe the heat we had in Oakhaven that year. Dry heat, the kind that just sticks to you and makes the air shimmer. Me and my boy, Kevin, we were out back doing chores like always. Nothing special, just burning some rabbit scraps. You know how it is in the country, you gotta get rid of the stuff, and burning it was the easiest way back then. We had this old burn barrel way out near the tree line, pine trees mostly, thick and dark. Cherokee Road, that's where we lived, still live, though things sure ain't the same anymore. Kevin was maybe 8 years old, small for his age, but quick. He was piling up branches and stuff while I was tossing in the rabbit bits. Stank something awful, but you get used to it. The smoke was rising straight up in the still air, barely a breeze that day. We were maybe 15 yards from the back of the house, just past the outhouse. Yeah, we still had an outhouse back then. Indoor plumbing was a luxury for some folks out there. Anyway, we were minding our business. The fire was crackling, and I remember telling Kevin to be careful with the flames, because the dry grass could catch quick. And that's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just shadows playing tricks on me. You know how it is with the heat and the smoke, everything looks a little blurry and distorted. But then it moved. It was in the trees, right at the edge of the woods. Something big, dark grey and, well, big. I mean seriously big. Taller than any man I ever saw, and wide too. It was just standing there in the shadows, looking at us. I froze. I mean really froze. Like my blood turned to ice water. I couldn't even breathe for a second. Kevin didn't see it at first. He was still messing with the sticks, humming some little tune. But I just stared, my eyes locked on this thing. It wasn't a bear. Bears are around these parts, sure, but I know bears. This wasn't no bear. It was too tall, stood too straight. And the color, that deep, smoky gray, almost silver in the dappled light filtering through the trees. Then Kevin looked up. He must have felt me staring, or maybe he sensed something was off in the air. He followed my eyes, and his humming just stopped, just cut off, and he went still too. You know how kids do, they mirror you. He went pale as a ghost. We just stood there, the three of us, me, Kevin, and it. Nobody moved, nobody made a sound except for the fire popping and crackling away like nothing was happening. This creature, it was just watching us. I could see its eyes, dark and deep set, under a heavy brow ridge, and it was covered in fur, thick, shaggy fur. It was like looking at something from another time, something that shouldn't exist, but was right there, real as anything. Time. It's weird how time works in moments like that. It felt like we were standing there for hours, locked in this silent standoff. But it was probably only minutes, maybe even seconds. But those seconds stretched out forever. Then, it started moving, slowly. Not towards us exactly, but more like along the tree line. It stepped out of the deepest shadows, and I got a better look at it. That's when I realized just how big it really was. 7 feet easy, maybe even more, and its arms were long, hanging down past its knees. It moved, deliberately, like it knew exactly where it was going and wasn't afraid of anything. And that's when it went towards the outhouse, our old rickety outhouse. Why the outhouse? I still can't figure that out. It walked right up to it, slowly, deliberately. It didn't make a sound, not a twig snap, not a rustle of leaves, nothing. Just this massive thing moving through the woods like it was gliding. It stopped right in front of the outhouse, maybe 5 feet away. Just stood there looking at it. Then it leaned forward, peering at it, tilting its head like it was trying to figure out what it was. It was the strangest thing, like it was curious, but dangerous curious. You know what I mean? Like a predator checking out its prey, but not sure what to make of it. I wanted to yell, to scream, to grab Kevin and run back to the house, but I was frozen solid, scared. I was beyond scared, terrified, like something primal just took over and my body shut down. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even blink, I don't think. Just stood there watching this monster, inspecting our outhouse. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. It just turned and walked back into the woods. No rush, no sudden movement, just turned and disappeared into the trees like smoke in the wind, and it was like it was never there. Except it was. We both saw it. The silence after it was gone was deafening. The fire still crackled, but it sounded different now. Everything sounded different. The birds were quiet. The air felt thick, heavy, like something had shifted, something fundamental had changed in that little patch of woods behind our house. I finally found my voice. It was just a croak. "Kevin, did you see that?" He just nodded, his eyes wide, tears starting to well up. He was shaking like a leaf. He grabbed onto my leg, his little fingers digging into my jeans. "Daddy!" What was that? I didn't know what to say. I still don't really know what to say. I don't know, son. I just don't know. We stayed out there for a while longer, just staring at the woods, not saying anything. The fear, it was like a physical weight pressing down on us. Finally, I managed to shake myself out of it. "Come on, Kev," I said, my voice still shaky. Let's go inside." We walked back to the house slow, real slow, looking over our shoulders the whole time. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, it made us jump. We got inside, and I locked the door, even though it was the middle of the afternoon. I pulled the curtains closed, shut everything up tight, like that would do any good against whatever that was. We sat in the kitchen for a long time. Kevin was quiet, just clinging to me. I tried to make sense of what we'd seen. A bear, no, too big, too tall, walked too straight. A man in a suit, no way. The fur, the way it moved, it was something else. Something not human. I tried to tell myself it was a trick of the light, heat stroke, anything to explain it away, but I knew what I saw. We both did. And the fear in Kevin's eyes, it mirrored my own. That wasn't just imagination. That evening things got weirder. We heard noises, outside, coming from the woods. It was hard to describe, like screams, but not human screams. More like animal screams, but deeper, louder, more unearthly. They echoed through the trees, chilling us to the bone. They went on for maybe an hour, then stopped as suddenly as they started. Silence again, but not peaceful silence. A heavy, watchful silence. We stayed inside that night, doors locked, windows shut. Couldn't sleep. Every little creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside, it made us jump. We were on edge, waiting, listening. For what? We didn't know. Just waiting for something. The next morning we went outside, hesitant, scared. The sun was bright, the birds were singing again, like nothing had happened. But it had happened. We knew it. And the woods, they felt different, like they were watching us, holding secrets. Then we heard about Homer Stickley. Old man Stickley lived down the road a piece, had a big apple orchard. He was raising hell. Said something had been in his orchard all night, ripping apples off the trees, stripping them bare. Said he'd heard these awful screams too, and then, a few days later, Homer said he saw it. The same thing we saw. He said he was out in his orchard late one night, full moon, heard the noises again, went to investigate, stupid old coot. And there it was, standing in the meadow next to his orchard, clear as day in the moonlight, tall, grey, walking on two legs. He said it was huge, like a monster out of a nightmare. Homer ran back to his house and locked himself in, didn't sleep a wink all night. He was scared stiff. He started telling everyone in town what he'd seen. And then other people started coming forward. Folks from around Oakhaven, out in the more rural parts. They'd seen something too, a big hairy creature, in the woods, near their farms, by the creek, everywhere. More than a dozen people, they said they'd seen it or heard it or seen signs of it. Big footprints in the mud, branches broken high up in the trees. Oakhaven, it went crazy. People were scared. They started locking their doors at night, keeping their kids inside, arming themselves. Whispers started. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, monster in the woods. Sheriff's department, they came out, took reports, made some half-hearted patrols. But they didn't find anything. Of course not. What were they going to find? Paw prints? It was all just whispers and fear. The sightings, they came and went over the years. Sometimes nothing for months, then someone would swear they saw it again. Out near the old logging trails, up in the hills. Always just glimpses, shadows in the trees. Never clear, never proof. Just stories and fear. But me and Kevin, we know what we saw that day. We saw it clear as day, just 15 yards away, inspecting our outhouse like it was the most fascinating thing in the world. That image, it's burned into my brain. That tall, grey figure, those dark eyes. I can still see it like it was yesterday. Kevin, he never forgot it either. He's a grown man now, living in the city, got a wife and kids, but he still talks about it sometimes. That day in the summer of '69, the creature in the woods. We never talk about it much to other people. Folks around here, they remember the stories, the whispers, but they mostly try to forget, dismiss it as folklore, local legends. But we know better. We were there. We saw it. And to this day, I still can't explain it. What was it? What did it want? Why was it looking at our outhouse? I don't know. And I guess I never will. But sometimes, when I'm out back, working in the yard, I still glance over at the tree line, just for a second, just to make sure it's not still there, watching. Story 13. Look, I know how this sounds. I know people tell stories online all the time, some real, some not so much, but I swear on everything I hold dear, this happened. Every single detail, exactly as I remember it, because how could I forget? It's burned into my brain. It was May, 1989. California sunshine, that perfect, almost blinding kind. I lived in Meadowbrook then. Small town, quiet life, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else's business, but in a way that's almost comforting. Except sometimes quiet gets boring, and that afternoon I was bored stiff. I loved to hike, always had. Growing up in Meadowbrook, Cobble Canyon was practically my backyard. Miles of trails, twisting and turning through those hills, overlooking the whole town. I'd hiked most of them 100 times, but there was always something new to see, some different angle, some flower I hadn't noticed before. That day, though, I wasn't looking for flowers. I needed to clear my head. Work was stressing me out, relationship stuff, the usual 20-something drama. Nature was my reset button. I decided to go up to Cobble Canyon, not the usual well-trodden paths near the main entrance, no. I wanted to go deeper, further in. I knew about the old Cobb estate up Lake Street. Kind of spooky, abandoned mansion vibes. There was a dirt road that went right up to it, ending near an old water reservoir. From there, a whole network of less maintained trails snaked out, disappearing into the really wild part of the canyon. That's where I wanted to be. So, I drove up Lake Street, past the last few houses that seemed to cling to the edge of the town, until the asphalt gave way to gravel, and finally just stopped at a makeshift parking area at the end of the road. It was pretty deserted. Just my beat-up Honda Civic and maybe one other car, way off in the distance. Good. Solitude was the goal. I got out, grabbed my backpack, water, snacks, you know the drill, and started walking towards the Cobb estate. Even the air felt different up there, thicker, heavier maybe, or maybe that was just my imagination. The reservoir was exactly as I remembered, concrete walls, kind of mossy, a low fence around it. Nothing special, but right next to it, almost hidden in the bushes, was this narrower path. Not really marked, just a break in the vegetation where people had clearly walked before. That was my entry point. I took it. The path immediately started to climb, getting steeper quickly. The trees got denser, and the sunlight filtering through the leaves turned dappled, almost eerie. The sounds of the town faded away fast, replaced by just the rustle of leaves, bird calls, the normal canyon noises. For a while, it was exactly what I wanted. Peaceful, calming. Then I reached this ravine. It wasn't huge, just a dip in the landscape where water ran, probably more in winter, but even now it was damp and cool. The path crossed it, following the small stream uphill. I stepped onto the damp earth, and that's when I heard it. Footsteps, not mine. Definitely not mine. They were above me, on the slope of the ravine, further up. Heavy footsteps, like someone walking or maybe even running uphill through loose rocks and undergrowth. But there wasn't anyone. I could see through the trees. No one. Just me and the silence, and these heavy, unnatural footsteps. My heart started to pick up. I stopped walking, stood absolutely still, and listened. The footsteps stopped too. Complete silence again, except for the distant birds. Okay, maybe it was just an animal. Deer, maybe. Though deer usually didn't sound that heavy, that deliberate. Then I heard rocks shifting, scrabbling sounds above me, and then pebbles, little stones, dislodged from the hillside, started to bounce and clatter down the slope, landing near my feet. Some of them were bigger than pebbles. One was almost fist-sized, landed right in front of me with a thud. If that had hit me, a chill ran down my spine. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just a deer. Something was definitely up there, and it was moving above me on the steep slope. I felt this sudden urge to turn back, to get out of there, back to the car, back to safety. But curiosity, that stupid, nagging human curiosity, held me rooted to the spot. What was it? What was making those sounds? I started walking again, but slower now, much slower, more cautiously. I kept my eyes fixed on the slope above, trying to see through the trees and bushes. The path continued to follow the ravine, and I noticed a place where the hillside climbed really steeply, almost vertical in places. But there was this kind of natural staircase, formed by roots and rocks, leading upwards. It looked climbable. Another sound, different this time, rhythmic, chopping, like someone was hacking at wood with an axe, but duller, muffled. Chop, chop, chop. It echoed through the trees, distorted by the canyon walls. The sound seemed to be coming from higher up, in the direction of the steep climb. My breath caught in my throat. Against every sensible instinct screaming at me to get out, I decided to climb. I told myself it was just to get a better view, to see what was making that noise, to figure out if it was something dangerous or just my imagination playing tricks. Lies I told myself to justify the stupid, terrifying pull to go towards the weirdness instead of running away. I started to scramble up the steep slope, hand over hand, pulling myself up by roots and tree branches, loose dirt under my boots, sliding with every step. It was hard work, and my heart was pounding, partly from exertion, mostly from fear. With each pull upwards, I heard that chopping sound clearer. Chop, chop, chop. It was regular, steady, and still muffled, like it was coming from behind something or deep in the woods. I still couldn't see anything, just trees, bushes, rocks. Finally, panting, I reached the top of the steepest part. The terrain leveled out a little, and I found myself on a narrow ridge. Dense bushes grew on both sides of me, almost forming a tunnel, and right there in front of me, almost completely hidden by the overgrown bushes, was a gap, a dark opening. It looked like a hole in the bushes, but it was more than that. It was a kind of tunnel, like someone or something had burrowed through the dense growth, just wide enough to crawl through, and it was leading deeper. I hesitated. Standing there, catching my breath, staring at that dark hole in the bushes, I felt a wave of pure dread wash over me. Everything in my gut screamed at me, "Don't go in there. Turn back. Now." This was insane. Climbing a steep slope, following weird sounds, finding a hidden tunnel in the middle of nowhere. This was straight out of a bad horror movie. But that damned curiosity, it was like a drug. And the chopping sound, still chop, 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 seemed to be coming from the other side of the tunnel. I had to know. I had to see what was on the other side. Swallowing hard, I dropped to my hands and knees and started crawling into the tunnel. It was dark, even though it was still daytime outside. The bushes were thick and thorny, scraping at my clothes, pulling at my hair. The air inside felt different, colder, damper. It smelled earthy, musky, something I couldn't quite place, and it wasn't pleasant. The tunnel wasn't long, maybe 10, 15 feet, but it felt like forever. My heart was hammering against my ribs. Every rustle, every snap of a twig sounded amplified in the confined space. I kept expecting something to grab my ankle, to jump out from the darkness. Then suddenly I was through. I tumbled out the other end, blinking in the sudden light. I found myself standing on a wider path, not overgrown like the one by the ravine. This was an old path, clearly once maintained, though now cracked and broken in places, covered with fallen leaves and pine needles. But it was definitely a path, and it led towards power lines. I could see them through the trees, further up the ridge, those massive metal towers, stark against the sky, humming with electricity. This path must have been some kind of access road for maintaining them, which made sense in a weird, unsettling way. This whole area felt forgotten, overgrown, like it hadn't been touched in years. The chopping sound was louder here, clearer. Chop, chop, chop. It still sounded like someone was hacking at wood, but it was different now, sharper, more metallic. Clang, 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 like metal hitting metal with a dull thud in between. Following the path, it wound upwards again, gently climbing towards the power lines. As I walked, the trees thinned out and the view opened up. And there it was, Meadowbrook. Spread out below me, houses like tiny toy blocks, streets like grey ribbons, the whole town miniature and silent in the distance. From up here, it looked peaceful, idyllic. But up here, on this forgotten path, heading towards those humming towers, surrounded by that strange chopping sound, peace was the last thing I felt. A feeling of unease was creeping into me, settling in my stomach like a cold stone. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was something deeper, something wrong. This whole place felt wrong. The silence, broken only by that rhythmic metallic clang, the deserted path, the humming power lines, the feeling of being watched, even though I knew I was alone. The path led to a rocky outcrop, a kind of natural platform of bare stone jutting out from the hillside. Perfect view of the town, probably a nice place to sit and relax normally. Today, it just felt exposed, vulnerable. I walked out onto the outcrop. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky. The afternoon was turning into late afternoon. Shadows were lengthening across the canyon. Twilight wouldn't be far off. I thought maybe I should head back soon. The feeling of wrongness was getting stronger, pressing in on me. I stood there for a moment looking out at Meadowbrook, trying to catch my breath, trying to calm myself down, trying to convince myself that I was just being paranoid, that the sounds were just something normal, explained by logic. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stumbled into something I shouldn't have, something unnatural. It was time to go. Definitely time to go. I turned to start back down the path, and that's when I saw it. Just a flicker at the edge of my vision, something moving in the trees to my left. Peripheral vision stuff, you know? The kind of thing you register without consciously seeing it. But it was enough to make me stop dead in my tracks. I turned my head slowly, cautiously, towards where I'd seen the movement. And there it was, standing in the shadows under the trees, about 30-40 feet away, just watching me. It was black, completely black, darker than the shadows around it, and hairy, covered in thick, dark fur. It was hard to make out details in the dim light, but I could see the shape, the outline, bipedal, standing upright, like a person, but not a person, something else. It was tall, taller than me, easily, maybe 6 feet, maybe more, and bulky, heavy-looking, and those dark patches of fur seemed to shimmer in the fading light. I froze, completely, utterly frozen. My mind just blanked, stared, tried to process what I was seeing. This couldn't be real. This had to be a trick of the light, a shadow, a bear. But it was standing upright. Bears don't stand upright like that, not naturally, and it was moving, slowly, shifting its weight from one foot to the other. Its head was down, tilted slightly, as if it was studying me, observing me. A surge of fear ripped through me, cold and sharp. This wasn't a deer. This wasn't a bear. This was something else. Something I didn't understand. Something terrifying. My breath hitched in my throat. I tried to speak, to scream, to yell for help, but nothing came out. My vocal cords seemed paralyzed. My lungs wouldn't work. I just stood there, rooted to the rock, staring at this thing. Then, slowly, hesitantly, I took a step forward. Just one step. Stupid, I know. Insane. But something in me, a weird, twisted kind of curiosity, still outweighed the screaming fear. I had to know what it was. I had to understand. "Hello?" I croaked out, my voice cracking, barely a whisper. Is anyone there?" The figure didn't move for a second. Then, slowly, deliberately, it straightened up. It stood fully upright now, head still tilted slightly, but taller, imposing. And it took a step forward too, towards me. The fear exploded in me then, raw, primal terror. I wanted to run, to bolt, to turn and flee back down the path, but my legs wouldn't work. They were locked, frozen solid. Another step. Closer now. I could see more details. The fur wasn't just dark, it was coarse, matted, and it wasn't uniform black. There were shades of brown, grey mixed in. It wasn't like fur you see on an animal. It looked thicker, denser, and the shape, the way it moved, it was almost monkey-like, but bigger, stronger, more human, in a twisted, distorted way. It was about 20 feet away now, close enough to see its face, or what I thought was its face. It was still shadowed, mostly hidden by the fur, but I could make out features, flat nose, low brow, dark eyes, gleaming in the shadows. And then it did something that made my blood run cold, something that shattered any remaining vestige of logical explanation, any attempt to rationalize what I was seeing. It raised its hand, not like a person raising their hand to wave, but similar. It lifted its arm slowly, deliberately, and raised its hand to about shoulder height, and it waved, just a slight movement of the hand back and forth, but unmistakable, a wave like a greeting or a farewell. My mind reeled. A wave. This thing, this creature was waving at me. Was it friendly, or was it mocking me? Was this some kind of twisted game? I still couldn't speak, couldn't move, but my hand, almost involuntarily, started to lift, as if mirroring its gesture, as if compelled to respond to this bizarre, terrifying greeting. Slowly, hesitantly, I raised my own hand, and I waved back. A small, weak, trembling wave, but a wave nonetheless. And the creature, it responded. It waved again, the same slow, deliberate movement of its hand. A mirrored wave, reflecting my own terrified gesture. We stood there, frozen, facing each other in the fading light of the canyon, exchanging these bizarre, silent waves. Me, a petrified hiker on a rocky outcrop, and it, this black, hairy, monkey-like creature in the shadows, waving at each other. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. It simply turned and walked away, back into the trees, into the shadows, disappeared, as if it had just evaporated. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, staring at the empty space where it had been, my hand still raised, frozen mid-wave, my heart pounding in my chest, deafeningly loud. Silence. Absolute, utter silence. The canyon noises had stopped. The bird calls, the rustling leaves, everything, just silence, and the echo of my own terrified breath. And then, faintly, distantly, carried on the still evening air, I heard it again. Clang, clang, clang. The chopping sound, returning, as if it had never stopped, as if nothing had happened, as if the creature, the encounter, the wave, had all been a hallucination, a figment of my overstressed imagination. But it wasn't. I knew it wasn't. I had seen it. I had waved at it, and it had waved back. I finally found the strength to move. My legs were still shaky, weak, but they worked. I turned and stumbled back down the path, scrambling, almost running. I didn't stop until I was back at my car, heart still hammering, hands still trembling. I drove home in a daze. Didn't speak to anyone. Couldn't speak to anyone. How could I explain it? Who would believe me? A hairy, black monkey thing in Cobble Canyon that waved? It sounded insane, even to me. I've told a few people over the years, close friends mostly. They look at me funny. Some try to be polite, nod and smile, and then change the subject. Others just outright laugh. And I don't blame them. I wouldn't believe it either if someone told me. But I know what I saw. I know what happened. Out there in Cobble Canyon, in the fading light, I had an encounter with something I still can't explain. And to this day, sometimes when it's quiet and I'm alone, I still hear that faint clang, clang, clang in my head, and I wonder what it was, what it meant. And I think about that wave, that bizarre, terrifying wave, and I just don't know. And I don't think I ever will. It just stopped. Like that. Story 14. It was supposed to be a break. That's all it was supposed to be. June of '88, and I needed to get away from everything. City noise, work pressure, people in general. I'd heard about Shadow Creek in the Sierras, how remote it was, untouched wilderness. Seemed perfect. I packed my gear, told my boss I needed a few days of personal time, vague enough, right? And drove out. The drive itself was beautiful. Winding roads, trees getting thicker, the air getting cleaner. By the time I reached the trailhead, I could practically taste the pine. I shouldered my pack, felt the familiar weight settle, and started walking. The path was narrow, clearly not heavily used. Just what I wanted. Hours in, I found a spot that felt right. A small clearing near a decent-sized creek, surrounded by tall pines that muffled any sound from further out. Perfect isolation. Setting up camp was automatic. Tent up, sleeping bag laid out, fire pit cleared. I always liked the methodical nature of it, the way it grounded you. As the afternoon light started to fade, I switched on my shortwave radio. Just to get a sense of the world out there, you know. Usually it's just static and faint signals bouncing all over the place. But that evening, reception was surprisingly clear. I caught snippets of news broadcasts, some music stations fading in and out, voices from distant cities. It was like listening to ghosts whispering across the airwaves. Then, around dusk, I stumbled across an old Western radio show, the kind with crackly sound effects and exaggerated voices, a guy in a drawl, narrating some dusty tale of cowboys and outlaws. It was cheesy, sure, but somehow, out there in the wilderness, it was kind of comforting. I sat by the fire I'd finally got going, listening to this old-timey show, the flames flickering, the trees swaying gently in the evening breeze. For a while, it was exactly the peace I'd been craving. It wasn't totally silent, though. Even in the deep woods, there are always sounds. Crickets chirping, the creek gurgling, the rustle of leaves. Earlier, when I was setting up, I'd heard some voices in the distance. Seemed like other campers, maybe, passing through or setting up further down the trail. Just faint murmurs, too far away to make out words, but enough to know I wasn't completely alone in the area. I hadn't seen anyone directly, and frankly, I preferred it that way. But those distant sounds, voices just beyond the trees, they were normal, expected in a place like this, even if remote. It was just the background noise of being in nature. Humans in nature, a bit removed, but still there. Then it happened. The radio show was still playing, some saloon scene with fake piano music and muffled dialogue when it cut out. Just static. Weird. The reception had been so good earlier. I fiddled with the dial, trying to get it back, but nothing. Just hiss and crackle. I figured maybe the signal had just faded out completely now that night was properly setting in amongst the mountains. I was about to switch it off when I heard it. It started low, almost like a groan, then built rapidly, rising in pitch and volume until it became a scream. But not like any scream I'd ever heard before, not human. Deeper, raw, animalistic, but with an edge of something else, something intelligent, like something in unbelievable agony, but also furious. It was bone-chilling. It wasn't just loud, it vibrated through the air, making my chest feel tight. It cut through the peaceful sounds of the forest, obliterating them. Everything else went silent, as if even the crickets and the wind were stunned into stillness. It came from somewhere close by, definitely closer than those distant voices I'd heard earlier, maybe across the creek, hard to pinpoint exactly in the dark. But it wasn't far, and it wasn't just the scream itself, it was the sheer terror in it. That was the part that got under my skin. It wasn't just a sound, it was pure, unadulterated pain and terror vocalized. It made my blood run cold, every hair on my body stood on end, and I froze, completely and utterly frozen. For a long moment, I just sat there, paralyzed by fear, the static from the radio buzzing in my ears, now a meaningless white noise counterpoint to the echo of that scream still ringing in my head. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I could feel the pulse throbbing in my temples. My breath hitched in my throat, and for a second I felt like I might actually pass out. I wanted to scream myself, to run, to do anything but just sit there and listen to the silence that followed, a silence heavier and more oppressive than any noise. Then slowly the silence started to break. Little sounds first, tentative crickets resuming their chirping, a faint rustle of leaves returning with the breeze, and the creek, always the creek, gurgling on, indifferent to whatever had just happened. I took a shaky breath. Okay. Panic attack over, I told myself, trying to rationalize it away. Maybe it was an animal, a mountain lion screaming. But that didn't sound right. Mountain lions scream, sure, but they don't sound like that. And they certainly don't scream with that kind of agony. But what else could it be? There was no human sound in that scream. None. Just primal raw terror and pain. But that intelligence? I couldn't shake that feeling. Curiosity, stupid curiosity, started to creep in, pushing back against the fear. Stupid because in that moment, the only sensible thing would have been to zip myself into my tent and stay there until morning. Smart people would have done that. But something about that scream, its sheer unnatural quality, had sparked a morbid curiosity in me. I had to know what made that sound. I grabbed my flashlight, the heavy mag light I always carry, switched it on, the beam cutting through the darkness, a weak, pathetic little finger of light in the vast blackness of the woods. It didn't feel like much protection against whatever was out there. But it was something. Taking another deep breath, I forced myself to stand up, my legs feeling shaky and weak. I pointed the flashlight in the direction I thought the scream had come from, towards the creek. The trees around the campsite were dense, the flashlight beam swallowed up by the darkness after only a few feet. Everything beyond that little circle of light was impenetrable black. I started walking slowly, cautiously towards the creek, stepping over roots and rocks, the beam of the flashlight jumping nervously ahead of me. The sounds of the forest seemed amplified now, every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, sounding like something approaching. My senses were on high alert, straining to hear anything, see anything, anything that would explain that scream. And then I smelled it. At first, it was just a faint whiff carried on the breeze, sweetish, sickly sweet like rotting fruit. Overripe fruit left in the sun too long. It was unpleasant, but at first I didn't connect it to the scream. Just another smell of the woods, decaying leaves, damp earth, maybe some animal carcass nearby. But as I got closer to the creek, the smell got stronger and stronger. It became overpowering, nauseating. No longer just rotten fruit, it was something else, something deeper, more corrupted. Like fruit that had been rotting for weeks, months, festering in the dark, combined with something meaty, something decaying and rancid. It made my stomach churn, and I had to breathe through my mouth to avoid gagging. The air itself felt thick with it, heavy and cloying, and that's when I saw it. Just a glimpse, fleeting, in the edge of the flashlight beam. A shape, dark and massive, moving down towards the creek. It was big, really big, bigger than a bear, bigger than anything I could even imagine being out here in these woods. It was low to the ground, but its sheer bulk was undeniable. It moved quickly, powerfully, crashing through the undergrowth, branches snapping, leaves flying. It was gone as fast as it appeared, vanished into the deeper darkness beyond the creek bank. But the image was burned into my brain. That dark shape moving with impossible speed and strength, the overwhelming stench of rot clinging to the air. It wasn't an animal, not anything natural. I stood there, rooted to the spot, flashlight shaking in my hand, heart pounding even harder now. Fear had morphed into something else, something deeper, more primal. It wasn't just fear for my safety anymore. It was fear of the unknown, fear of something fundamentally wrong with the world. That scream, that smell, that shape, it was all wrong. It didn't belong. I backed away slowly, still facing the direction where I'd seen it, flashlight beam sweeping nervously across the trees. The smell was still strong, lingering in the air, making my head spin. I retreated step by step, back towards my campsite, my mind racing, trying to process what I'd just seen, what I'd just smelled, what I'd just heard. It was impossible to make sense of. I practically ran back to my tent, stumbling in the dark, tripping over roots, desperate to get back to the relative safety of the nylon walls. I fumbled with the zipper, hands shaking so badly I could barely grip it. Got inside, scrambled backwards until my back was pressed against the tent wall, facing the entrance. I kept the flashlight pointed at the zipper, ready to react to... what? I didn't even know. I sat there for hours, it felt like, listening, straining my ears. The forest sounds were different now, imbued with a new layer of menace. Every rustle of leaves sounded like approaching footsteps. Every snap of a twig sounded like something breaking through the undergrowth. The smell, the rotten fruit smell, it was still there, faint but persistent, seeping into the tent, filling my nostrils with its nauseating sweetness. Sleep was impossible. My mind was too wired, my body too tense. Every nerve ending screamed with awareness. I kept expecting to hear something, see something, feel something. The hours crawled by, each one an eternity of fear and anticipation. I closed my eyes, trying to block it all out. But then images flashed behind my eyelids, that dark shape, the trees swaying in the dark, the flash of the creek water, and that scream echoing and re-echoing in my skull. When I did finally drift off, it was a shallow, restless sleep, filled with nightmares. Dark shapes moving in the woods, voices whispering just beyond the tent walls, the smell of rotten fruit getting stronger and stronger until it was suffocating me. I woke up again and again, heart pounding, disoriented, unsure if I'd actually slept or just been trapped in some waking nightmare. Eventually, the faintest hint of dawn started to creep into the sky, a pale grey light filtering through the tent fabric. Slowly, the forest sounds shifted, the nocturnal noises giving way to the first chirps of birds. It was still dark, but there was a change in the air, a lessening of the oppressive feeling of the night. Or maybe it was just my own exhaustion starting to numb my fear. As soon as it was properly light enough to see, I was moving. No breakfast, no packing up neatly, just throwing everything into my backpack as fast as I could. Tearing down the tent, stuffing it haphazardly into its bag, not caring if it was folded right, not caring about anything but getting out of there. The smell was still faintly present, but diluted now by the morning air. Or maybe I was just getting used to it. I practically ran back down the trail, stumbling and slipping on the uneven ground, pack bouncing against my back. Every shadow looked like it might conceal something. Every sound made me jump. I didn't stop until I reached the trailhead and saw my car, parked in the bright morning sunlight. It was like crossing a boundary, stepping back into the real world, away from the nightmare woods. I drove straight back to civilization, back to the city, back to noise and people and traffic. Anything to get away from the silence and the shadows and the smell of Shadow Creek. I didn't even stop until I reached a diner in the first small town I came to. Just needed coffee, greasy food, the sound of human voices, something normal. The diner was almost empty, just a few locals at the counter. I ordered coffee and a breakfast sandwich, trying to act casual, like nothing had happened. But I could still feel the adrenaline pumping through my veins, still feel the residue of fear clinging to me like that stench. I was listening to the chatter around me, trying to ground myself in reality, when I overheard something that made me freeze again. Two guys at the counter were talking. Local guys, farmers or ranchers maybe, judging by their clothes and accents. "Weirdest thing, I tell you," one of them was saying, scratching his head. "Went out to the shed this morning, get some feed for the animals, and the darn thing's been raided. Food clean gone." "Raided?" the other guy said. "Raccoons." "Raccoons don't open latches like that, and they sure as hell don't reach 7 feet up. This was clean off the top shelf. Stuff was stacked high, you know." 7 feet, the other guy chuckled. "Bear must have got smart." "Bear, maybe, but no bear I ever saw stands on 2 legs like that, and leaves no tracks, just gone, like it was lifted straight out of there." They went on talking about it, shrugging it off as some mystery, something unexplained. But I heard them, 7 feet up, food stolen from a shelf 7 feet off the ground. And suddenly it all clicked into place. The scream, the shape, the size, the smell, and the height. Whatever I saw, whatever screamed in the woods that night, it wasn't a bear, it wasn't a mountain lion, and it wasn't human. It was something else, something big, something strong, Something that could reach 7 feet into the air and steal food without leaving a trace. Something that smelled like death and decay and screamed with a terror that echoed in my soul. I never went back to Shadow Creek. I never told anyone about what happened, not really. Who would believe me? And honestly, a part of me doesn't even want to believe it myself. I try to rationalize it, to tell myself it was just a nightmare, just stress, just a vivid hallucination brought on by exhaustion and fear. But then I remember the scream, the smell, the fleeting glimpse of that massive dark shape, and the story about the food stolen 7 feet up. And I know deep down that what I experienced in Shadow Creek that night was real. Something real and terrifying, something I can't explain, and something that still haunts my dreams to this day. I just hope, whatever it was, it stayed in those mountains and never came looking for me again. I still get chills just thinking about that scream and that awful smell. Story 15. Until it did. That night, the banging, it wasn't like someone knocking at the door. It was heavier, duller, like something solid hitting wood. Coming from the back of the house, towards the woods, I figured it was probably just a branch fallen against the siding. Wind picks up sometimes at night, coming off the forest. So I ignored it at first, tried to go back to sleep. But it kept happening, maybe every minute or two. Bang, bang, just those 2 thuds. Finally, I got out of bed. Heart was starting to thump a little faster. Grabbed my robe, flicked on the porch light in the back, and peered out the kitchen window. Nothing, just the usual backyard, looking spooky in the shadows and moonlight filtering through the trees. No branches down, nothing obvious. The banging stopped as soon as I turned the light on, which was weird. Okay, just my imagination, or a branch settled, I muttered to myself, trying to sound braver than I felt. I switched off the light and was about to go back inside when I smelled it. God, that smell. It hit me like a physical wall, rank, putrid, like rotting meat, but mixed with something else, something sour and chemical, like spoiled eggs gone really, really bad. My stomach lurched immediately. I recoiled, gagging, actually stumbling backwards and almost tripping over the kitchen chair. It was that intense, that disgusting. I clamped a hand over my mouth and nose, trying not to breathe it in. Even through my hand, it was overpowering. I slammed the kitchen window shut, even though it was already closed. Crazy, I know, but it was instinct, just wanting to block it out. The smell seemed to be coming from everywhere, seeping in somehow. I held my breath as long as I could, then had to gasp for air. And it was there, lingering, coating the inside of my nostrils, making me want to vomit. I scrambled back inside, locking the kitchen door and the back door to the porch, even though they were already locked. Felt utterly ridiculous, double locking doors against a smell. But that's how freaked out I was. I retreated to the living room, farther away from the back of the house, and just sat there on the couch, trying to calm down, heart racing, still fighting the nausea. The smell, thankfully, seemed a little less intense in the living room, but it was still there, a faint, stomach-churning undertone that lingered in the air. I spent the rest of the night huddled on the couch, too scared to go back to bed. Every creak of the house, every rustle outside, made me jump. I kept listening for the banging, for the smell, but everything was quiet except for the normal night sounds. As the sun started to come up, that awful stench seemed to fade. By morning it was mostly gone, just a lingering, queasy feeling in my gut and the memory of that overpowering stink. I tried to rationalize it, maybe a dead animal in the woods behind the house. But it wasn't like any dead animal smell I'd ever encountered. This was different. And that banging, it just didn't fit with a dead animal scenario. Still, I told myself I was overreacting, stressed out, maybe imagining things a bit. Rural life, isolated house, things get amplified in your head at night, right? For days, maybe a week, nothing happened. The smell was gone, the banging stopped. I started to relax, to push it to the back of my mind. Almost convinced myself it was just a weird, isolated incident. Maybe some weird gas pocket or something from the swampy part of the woods. I don't know. I wanted to believe anything but what my gut was telling me, that something wasn't right. Then it started again. This time it was louder, more forceful. It wasn't just bang, bang, it was bang, 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 and faster, more insistent. Again, late at night, again, from the back of the house. Again, followed immediately by that horrifying smell. But this time the smell was worse, even stronger, even more disgusting. It filled the house faster, thicker. It felt like it was coating my tongue, the back of my throat. I could taste it, that vile, rotten sweetness, that putrid decay. It was so intense it made my eyes water. I actually threw up in the kitchen sink. Dry heaves mostly, but still, terror. That's the only word for it. Pure, unadulterated terror. Not just scared or uneasy. Terror down to my bones. I slammed the windows closed again. Even though they were already closed and locked, I checked them all frantically, like that would do any good against this. I stuffed towels under the kitchen door, under the back door, even though I knew it was pointless. The smell was everywhere, inside, outside, it didn't matter. And then I heard the other sound. From the woods, deeper in, beyond the immediate backyard. It wasn't banging anymore, it was rhythmic, deep, heavy thuds, like something big, really big, hitting against trees. Thump, thump, thump. Not like chopping wood. Duller, heavier, and rhythmic in a way that was unsettlingly deliberate. Like drums, but made of wood, and very, very deep. It echoed through the woods, through the night air, and vibrated right through the floorboards and up into me. The smell, the thumping, the pounding on the back of the house, all happening at once. It was sensory overload, a nightmare unfolding in my own kitchen. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen solid with fear. I backed away from the kitchen into the living room and just stood there, shaking, listening, trying to breathe through my mouth, trying not to inhale too much of that god-awful stench. The wood thumping from the forest kept going, steady and relentless. Thump, thump, thump. The banging on the house stopped again after a while, thankfully, but the smell, it lingered. Not as overwhelmingly strong as it was at first, but still present, a constant nauseating reminder. And the thumping from the woods just went on and on. For hours, it felt like. Until just before dawn, it finally faded away. And with it, slowly, so did the worst of the smell. I didn't sleep a wink that night. Sat huddled in the corner of the living room, staring out the front window, watching the sky lighten, jumping at every noise. By morning, the smell was almost gone again. But the fear wasn't. It had burrowed deep inside me, a cold knot of dread in my stomach that wouldn't go away. I spent the next few days on edge, jumpy. Every little sound outside made me tense up. I started keeping all the doors and windows locked all the time, even during the day, which is ridiculous, I know, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something connected to that smell, to those sounds. Then came the day in the garden. It was a beautiful summer afternoon. Sunny, warm, birds singing, everything felt deceptively normal. I was trying to get back to my routine, to prove to myself that I wasn't going crazy. Gardening is usually my therapy. It calms me, grounds me. I was weeding around my tomatoes, trying to focus on the feel of the soil between my fingers, the warmth of the sun on my skin. And then I saw it. Just off to the side of my tomato plants, near the edge of the woods, partially hidden under some ferns, was this mound, this disgusting, grotesque pile of stuff. It was black, thick, almost tarry-looking, and massive, way too big to be from any normal animal. It was like a mountain of feces, but not like anything I'd ever seen before. The smell wasn't as overpowering as the night smell, but it was still there, faintly, underlying the earthy smell of the garden, that same sickly, sweet, rotten stench. I cautiously got closer, wanting to see what it was, but dreading it at the same time. As I got nearer, the smell intensified. It was coming from this pile. I almost gagged again just looking at it. It was so unnatural, black, glistening with chunks of... I didn't even want to think about what the chunks were. It wasn't just animal waste. There was something else in it. Something darker, wrong, viscerally wrong, and the sheer size of it. It was huge, far too large for any deer or bear or anything I could imagine being in these woods. I backed away slowly, heart pounding again. I suddenly felt exposed, vulnerable, out in the open, like I was being watched. I glanced towards the woods. Shadows were deep under the trees, even in the afternoon sun, and everything suddenly felt menacing, quiet, and watchful. I scrambled back to the house, practically running, slammed the back door, locked it, leaned against it, gasping for breath. My hands were shaking, my legs felt weak. I went to the bathroom and threw up again, just from the sight and smell of it. Dry heaves until my stomach was empty and aching. I spent the rest of that day inside, windows closed, curtains drawn, even though it was broad daylight. Peeking out every now and then, but afraid to really look at the woods, at the garden. I felt trapped in my own house, a prisoner of fear. That evening, I was in the living room, trying to read, trying to distract myself. But I couldn't concentrate. My eyes kept drifting to the windows, to the woods beyond. Dusk was falling, shadows were lengthening, and that feeling of unease, of being watched, was growing stronger. It was still summer, so the evenings were long, twilight lingering for hours. I had the lights on inside, trying to make it feel brighter, safer. The dining room window, it's a big one, looks out towards the backyard and the woods beyond. I was sitting in my armchair, facing away from the window, but still, every now and then I'd glance over my shoulder just to check, just to make sure nothing was there. And then it was. Just a flicker of movement at first, in the periphery of my vision. I froze, my heart stopping in my chest. Slowly, cautiously I turned my head, and there it was, at the dining room window, looking in, a creature, a thing, not an animal, not like anything I'd ever seen or imagined. It was tall, incredibly tall, taller than the window frame, towering over my garden, dark, pitch black against the darkening twilight, covered in fur, shaggy, matted fur that seemed to ripple in the non-existent breeze. And it was massive, bulky, heavy, impossibly large. Its face, I didn't really see a face, just shadows and fur. But I saw the eyes, just glints of light, reflecting from my living room lamp. And they were too high, too far apart, not like human eyes, not like animal eyes. Something alien, wrong. Its arms, or legs, or whatever they were incredibly long, stretching down, dangling, almost touching the ground. They moved weirdly, loose-jointed, disjointed, like they shouldn't bend that way, like they were attached wrong. It just stood there, looking in, at me, through the window, for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds, frozen in place, staring. Then slowly, impossibly slowly, it moved. Not towards the window, not towards the house, but past the window, sliding sideways, out of my field of vision. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't scream. I just sat there, rigid with terror, listening. And then I heard it. Heavy, lumbering footsteps, moving away from the house, crashing through the undergrowth in the woods, getting fainter, fainter, then silence, except for my own ragged breathing and the pounding of my heart in my ears. I stayed in that chair, unmoving, for hours, until it was completely dark outside, until the first light of dawn started to creep in. Then, slowly, trembling, I got up, packed a bag, just essentials, clothes, wallet, keys.